there is a place in the middle of America that does not make sense. It sits between the Mississippi River to the east and the Great Plains to the west, between the Ozark Plateau to the north and the Ouachita Mountains to the south, and it has been drawing people in and spitting out strange stories for so long that the locals have stopped being surprised by most of them. They just file them somewhere in the back of their minds, next to all the other things they have seen or heard about and decided not to talk about with strangers. The Ozarks, not a single mountain range, not a single state, not a single anything, really. It is a high plateau that erosion has been eating from the edges for 300 million years, cutting rivers and hollows and bluffs and caves into what was once a flat seabed, and what it has become is one of the most geologically complex, biologically diverse, and historically strange pieces of ground on the North American continent. Geologists will tell you it is ancient beyond easy comprehension. Archaeologists will tell you people have been living here for at least 14,000 years, maybe considerably longer. Folklorists will tell you that the stories coming out of these hills do not follow the patterns you would expect. And historians, the ones who have dug deepest into the documentary record, will sometimes pull you aside and say that what they have found does not quite fit the story they were taught to tell. This video is about all of those things. It is about the geology first, because you cannot understand anything else about the Ozarks without understanding the ground it sits on. Then it goes into the archaeology, which is stranger than the standard textbooks suggest. Then the pre-Columbian history, which is poorly understood and possibly poorly reported. Then the contact era record, which raises questions that have never been satisfactorily answered. And then the deeper layer underneath all of it, the things the digging keeps turning up that nobody quite knows how to explain. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. The Ozark Plateau sits on some of the oldest exposed rock in North America. The core of it, the Street, Francois Mountains in southeastern Missouri, is a cluster of knobs and ridges made of granite and rhyolite that formed about 1.5 billion years ago during a period of volcanic activity that geologists call the Grenville orogeny. These are not big mountains. The highest point in the Ozarks, Taum Sauk Mountain in the Street Francois Range, reaches only 1,772 feet above sea level. But age matters more than height here, and in terms of age, these rocks are in a completely different category from almost everything around them. They are Precambrian, which means they were already old when the first complex multicellular animals appeared on Earth. They predate the Cambrian explosion of animal life by more than 1 billion years. They were already ancient when trilobites were new. When you stand on that granite, you are standing on the floor of a world that no longer exists in any form recognizable to us. The Ozarks proper, the plateau that most people mean when they say the Ozarks, is made of limestone and dolomite that formed in shallow tropical seas during the Paleozoic era, roughly 300 to 500 million years ago. Missouri and Arkansas were near the equator then, covered by warm shallow water full of marine invertebrates whose shells built up over millions of years into thick layers of carbonate rock. When the seas withdrew, what they left was a high, flat platform of sedimentary rock sitting on top of that ancient igneous core. Then, erosion went to work. Rivers cut downward into the plateau, carving valleys and exposing older and older layers of rock as they went. The result is a landscape where the age of the rock changes dramatically, depending on how deep into a valley you go. On the ridgetops, you are standing on relatively young limestone. Down in the river bottoms, you might be walking on rock that was laid down 400 million years ago. And underneath all of it, the groundwater has been doing its own work for millions of years, dissolving the limestone from the inside and creating what is one of the most extensive karst systems in the world. Karst is the technical term for landscape shaped primarily by the dissolving of soluble bedrock, usually limestone or dolomite, by slightly acidic pond water. The Ozarks are one of the premier karst regions in North America. The Missouri portion alone contains more than 6,000 documented caves. Arkansas adds thousands more. There are springs throughout the region that discharge enormous volumes of water from underground aquifers, water that has sometimes traveled for miles through the rock before emerging into daylight. Mammoth Spring in Arkansas discharges more than 9 million gallons of water per hour. Big Spring in Missouri is considered one of the largest springs in the world, with an average daily discharge of 276 million gallons. These springs were not accidents. They were created by water moving through a three-dimensional maze of passages, chambers, and conduits carved into the limestone over millions of years. And many of those passages have never been fully explored. There are cave systems in the Ozarks that cavers have been mapping for decades and have still not found the end of. There are springs that discharge water whose source has never been definitively traced. There are aquifer connections that hydrologists have inferred but cannot prove because the passages connecting them are either flooded, inaccessibly narrow, or simply unknown. The Ozarks sit on a kind of Swiss cheese geology, honeycombed with passages and voids that collectively represent one of the most complex underground environments in North America. And people have been going into that underground environment for a very long time. The archaeological record of the Ozarks begins, by the standard account, around 14,000 years ago with the arrival of Paleo-Indian peoples at the tail end of the last ice age. Missouri and Arkansas were not glaciated during the Pleistocene. The great ice sheets that covered much of North America during the last glacial maximum stopped well to the north of the Ozark Plateau. What the region experienced instead was a periglacial climate, colder and drier than today, with a different mix of vegetation and a dramatically different fauna. The Ozarks during the late Pleistocene supported populations of mammoths, mastodons, ground sloths, horses, camels, giant beavers, and giant tortoises, as well as predators that included lions, cheetahs, and short-faced bears larger than any bear alive today. Into this landscape, sometime around 14,000 years ago, came the first human inhabitants. We know them primarily through their distinctive fluted projectile points, the Clovis and later Dalton points that archaeologists find in sites across the region. The Dalton culture is particularly interesting in the Ozark context because it appears to be a regional development, an adaptation of earlier Paleo-Indian traditions to the specific resources and landscape of the Ozarks during the transition from the Pleistocene to the Holocene. Dalton people, who were present in the Ozarks roughly 10,000 to 11,000 years ago, made distinctive corner-notch projectile points that show high levels of craftsmanship and consistent manufacturing standards across a wide geographic area. They used the same high-quality cherts, flint-like rock suitable for knapping, over and over again, and they transported these materials long distances from their sources, which tells us something about their mobility patterns and their awareness of the landscape's resource distribution. But the Dalton people were not the beginning of the Ozark story. They were not even close to the beginning. Under the Dalton sites, archaeologists have occasionally found evidence of an earlier presence, and the nature of that earlier presence is one of the more contested topics in Ozark archaeology. The Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania, excavated beginning in the 1970s, produced evidence of human occupation dating back to at least 16,000 years ago, and possibly much earlier, well before the Clovis horizon that was long considered the threshold of human presence in the Americas. Sites in South America, most notably Monteverde in Chile, have been dated to 14,500 years ago or more. The pre-Clovis question, the question of whether people were present in North America before the Clovis culture is documented, has shifted from a fringe debate to a mainstream one over the past 2 decades. And within that broader debate, there are researchers who believe that the Ozarks, with their extensive cave systems and rock shelters, may contain pre-Clovis evidence that has not yet been properly investigated, or that has been investigated but not yet fully published. The cave environment is one of the best preservation contexts in archaeology. The stable temperature, low humidity, and alkaline chemistry of limestone caves can preserve organic materials for tens of thousands of years in conditions where they would have decomposed within decades in the open air. Some of the oldest art in the world has been found in European caves, preserved by exactly these conditions. The Ozarks have thousands of caves. The question of what those caves might preserve, in terms of early human occupation, is one that cave archaeologists have been working on for decades, and the full picture is not yet in. What has been documented is already remarkable. The Ozark Bluff Dweller culture is the name given to a series of archaeological assemblages found in the dry rock shelters and caves of the Arkansas and Missouri Ozarks. These sites, excavated primarily in the early to middle 20th century, contained extraordinary collections of perishable materials that rarely survive in open-air sites. Baskets woven with sophisticated techniques, fabric made from plant fibers using twining and plaiting methods that show a high level of weaving expertise, cordage twisted from dogbane and other plant fibers, wooden tools, including digging sticks, bows, and arrow shafts, animal hide moccasins and bags, human hair, dried plant foods including corn, beans, squash, and a variety of wild plant species. The preservation was so good that when some of these materials were first found in the early 20th century, collectors and researchers initially assumed they were relatively recent. It took careful analysis to establish their true age, which in the case of many sites spans from around 2,000 to 500 years ago, placing them in what archaeologists call the late woodland and early Mississippian periods. But here is the first of many things in the Ozarks that does not quite fit the expected picture. The bluff dweller assemblages contain materials that are not where they are supposed to be. Cotton from Mexico or the Southwest. Marine shells from both the Gulf Coast and the Atlantic. Copper artifacts, whose source copper is from the Great Lakes region. Obsidian, from sources in the Rocky Mountains or the Southwest. These are not rare finds. They appear consistently across multiple sites, in quantities that suggest regular and organized exchange rather than occasional chance acquisition. The Ozarks sit at the center of what archaeologists call the Hopewell Interaction Sphere, a trading network that connected indigenous peoples from the Rocky Mountains to the Atlantic coast and from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes during the period roughly 2,000 to 1,500 years ago. The Hopewell people, named for a site in Ohio, built enormous earthworks and mound complexes throughout the eastern United States and maintained trade connections across a geographic range that covers most of the continent east of the Rockies. And the Ozarks were not a backwater in this network. They were, by the evidence of the material culture found in their sites, an active participant and possibly a key node in the exchange system. The question that archaeologists have been asking for a long time, and that has not been satisfactorily answered, is what exactly the Ozarks were producing or controlling that made them valuable enough to be part of this continental exchange network. One answer that has been proposed is chert. The Ozarks contain some of the finest chert deposits in North America, and high-quality chert was the primary raw material for stone tools throughout the prehistoric period. Burlington chert, which outcrops throughout the Ozarks, is a high silica, fine-grained rock that naps predictably and holds an edge well. Archaeological sites across the eastern United States contain tools made from Burlington and other Ozark cherts, demonstrating that this material was being traded or transported over distances of hundreds of miles from its source. But chert alone does not fully explain the Ozarks' position in the Hopewell Exchange network. The quantities of exotic materials found in Ozark sites suggest something more than a simple raw material exchange. There is copper in amounts that imply ceremonial importance. There are marine shells that would have had to travel from either coast. There are artifacts whose stylistic connections suggest relationships with groups from distant regions, relationships that would have required sustained contact rather than occasional trade. The Hopewell Interaction Sphere collapsed around 1,500 years ago, and archaeologists still debate why. Climate change, social disruption, epidemic disease, internal political instability, overextension of the exchange network, all of these have been proposed as contributing factors. What is clear is that after the Hopewell collapse, the pattern of long-distance exchange contracted dramatically across much of eastern North America. But in the Ozarks, the evidence suggests a more complex trajectory. The bluff dweller sites that have been dated to the post-Hopewell period continue to show connections to distant regions. They continue to contain exotic materials, and they show a level of specialized production, particularly in textiles and basketry, that suggests the Ozarks did not simply retreat into isolation after the Hopewell collapse. Something was still being made here, and something was still being exchanged. The cave archaeology of the Ozarks adds another layer to this picture that is not widely known outside of specialist circles. Throughout the region, archaeologists have documented human use of caves, not just as shelters or storage facilities, but as sites of ritual activity going back thousands of years. The evidence for this ritual use includes paintings and engravings on cave walls, the placement of artifacts in remote sections of caves far from any habitable area, and in some cases, the placement of human remains in locations that could only have been reached by deliberate effort and some degree of risk. The cave art of the Ozarks is not as famous as the Paleolithic cave paintings of Europe, and it is not as old, but it is extensive, technically sophisticated, and poorly understood. The glyphs at Saltpeter Cave in Missouri, the pictographs at Picture Cave, also in Missouri, the engravings at multiple sites in Arkansas, these represent a body of rock art that spans several thousand years of continuous practice and that contains imagery whose meaning has not been deciphered. Picture Cave, sometimes called Cathedral Cave by locals, is one of the most extraordinary archaeological sites in North America and one of the least known to the general public. Located in Warren County, Missouri, it contains more than 1,000 individual images painted and engraved on its walls and ceiling, created by multiple generations of artists over a period spanning roughly 1,000 years, from around 1,000 to 2,000 years ago. The images include human figures, animals, geometric designs, and a class of imagery that researchers have described as supernatural or ceremonial without being more specific, because more specific description would require an understanding of the belief system that produced the imagery, and that understanding is incomplete. What makes Picture Cave particularly significant is the context in which the art was produced. The cave is not a habitable space. It is deep, dark, and requires effort to penetrate beyond the entrance zone. The art is not concentrated near the entrance where natural light reaches. Much of it is in the interior, in sections of the cave that could only have been reached by artificial light, by people who went into the darkness deliberately and worked there. This is the same pattern seen in the great Paleolithic caves of Europe, where the most important and elaborate art is consistently found in the deepest, most inaccessible sections. Whatever was happening in Picture Cave was happening specifically in the dark, far from the surface, in a context that seems to have been deliberately separated from the ordinary world of daily life. The archaeology of the cave also shows that it was not a one-time event. The presence of charcoal from multiple periods, the layering of images over older images, the evidence of repeated visits over centuries, all suggest that whatever ritual practice was taking place here was maintained across generations, that people returned again and again to this particular darkness to do whatever they came to do. Other cave sites in the Ozarks show similar patterns. The Bradley Cave site in Arkansas, the Bat Cave site in Missouri, multiple unnamed and unexcavated sites throughout the region. All of them contain evidence of deep cave ritual use that spans long periods and that connects, at least stylistically, to the broader patterns of Mississippian and woodland ceremonial practice. But the Ozark cave ritual tradition also has elements that appear locally specific, elements that do not have obvious parallels elsewhere, and that suggest the development of a distinctive regional ceremonial complex that is only beginning to be understood. The Mississippian period, which archaeologists date roughly from 900 to 1600 CE, represents the apex of pre-Columbian cultural complexity in the eastern United States. It was a period of large-scale mound construction, intensive maize agriculture, long-distance trade, complex political organization, and what appears to have been a sophisticated ceremonial system connecting communities across much of the eastern continent. The most famous Mississippian site, Cahokia, located near present-day Street Louis, at the confluence of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers, was at its peak around 1100 CE. A city of 10 to 20,000 people, larger than contemporary London, with a central mound that still stands as the largest pre-Columbian earthwork in North America. Monk's Mound at Cahokia covers 14 acres at its base, stands 100 feet tall, and contains more material by volume than any of the Egyptian pyramids. It was built by human hands, one basket of earth at a time, over a period of roughly 200 years. The Ozarks sit immediately to the southwest of Cahokia, separated from the great city by the Missouri and Merrimack rivers. And the relationship between Cahokia and the Ozark region during the Mississippian period is one of the more interesting and contested questions in North American archaeology. The standard view holds that the Ozarks were a peripheral zone in the Mississippian world, a resource-rich but sparsely populated hinterland that supplied raw materials to the larger centers of political and economic power in the river valleys. This view has some evidence in its favor. The Ozarks do not contain the large platform mound complexes that characterize the major Mississippian centers. The population density of the Ozark uplands during the Mississippian period appears to have been lower than the population density of the river valley bottomlands, where maize agriculture was most productive. And the material culture found in Ozark sites is generally less elaborate than the material culture found in sites at the major Mississippian centers. But the peripheral view has problems. Recent survey and excavation work in the Ozark region has consistently found evidence of Mississippian period activity that does not fit the expected pattern of simple resource extraction. There are platform mounds in the Ozarks, not as large as the ones at Cahokia or the major sites in the Mississippi Valley, but present and built according to the same principles. There is evidence of long-distance exchange at multiple Ozark sites that connects them not just to Cahokia but to other major Mississippian centers across the eastern United States. There is evidence of maize agriculture in the Ozark River valleys at a scale that suggests organized production rather than simple subsistence farming. And there are sites that appear to have been ceremonially significant at a regional scale, drawing people from surrounding areas for ritual activities that required effort and organization to sustain. The Loman and Sterling phase Cahokia materials found in Ozark sites, roughly 900 to 1100 CE, are particularly interesting. These materials are stylistically and chemically traceable to Cahokia or to its immediate sphere of influence, and their presence in Ozark sites implies a relationship between Cahokia and the Ozarks that was more active and more organized than simple background exchange. Some researchers have argued that Cahokia was actively extracting resources from the Ozarks through organized trade relationships, or possibly through something more coercive, a kind of tribute system that brought chert, salt, and other Ozark products to the great city at the confluence. Others have argued that the relationship was more reciprocal, with Ozark communities serving as nodes in a distribution network that moved Cahokia's ceremonial goods and ideological influence into the interior of the continent. Still others have suggested that the relationship was more complex than either of these models, involving multiple different kinds of interactions at different times and in different places, some of which have left clear evidence in the archaeological record and some of which have not. The salt springs of the Ozarks deserve particular attention in this context. Salt was a critical resource in the pre-Columbian world, used for food preservation and probably for a variety of ceremonial purposes as well. The Ozarks contain some of the most productive salt spring sites in eastern North America. The salines of central Missouri, including sites near present-day Arrow Rock and Boonville, were major sources of salt for indigenous peoples throughout the region. Archaeological evidence at these sites shows intensive production activity spanning thousands of years, with the heaviest use occurring during the Woodland and Mississippian periods. The scale of production at some Ozark salt sites implies an output far in excess of local needs, output that must have been traded or exported to communities at considerable distances. Salt from Ozark Springs has been traced chemically to sites across the eastern United States, demonstrating that it was indeed moving in the continental trade networks. At Cahokia, which had no local salt source, Ozark salt would have been a necessity, not a luxury. The connection between Cahokia and the Ozark salt springs may have been one of the most important economic relationships in the Mississippian world, and it is one that has been consistently underplayed in the popular literature on Cahokia and its hinterlands. The question of what happened to Cahokia is relevant here because Cahokia's decline, which appears to have begun around 1200 CE and accelerated through the 13th and 14th centuries, roughly coincides with changes in the Ozark archaeological record that have not been fully explained. The population of Cahokia's immediate hinterland appears to have dropped dramatically in the 13th century, and there is evidence of movement of people from the Cahokia region into other areas during this period. Some researchers have proposed that refugees or emigrant populations from declining Cahokia moved into the Ozarks, the Missouri River Valley, and other areas during the Mississippian decline. Whether this movement happened, and if so, what form it took, is a matter of active research and debate. What is clear is that the Ozarks do not show a simple picture of continuous occupation and slow decline during the late Mississippian period. Some sites show evidence of abandonment during this period. Others show evidence of continued use or even intensification. The pattern is complex and geographically variable in ways that suggest multiple different processes were operating simultaneously. One of the most puzzling aspects of the late Mississippian and early historic period in the Ozarks is the question of population. When European explorers first penetrated the Ozark region in the 17th and 18th centuries, they found it substantially less densely populated than the archaeological evidence suggests it had been in earlier periods. De Soto's expedition of 1540 to 1542, which passed through parts of the lower Ozark region, encountered large indigenous settlements in the Arkansas River Valley and elsewhere, but the interior Ozarks appear to have been lightly occupied by the time of early European contact. This apparent depopulation of the Ozark interior in the period between roughly 1400 CE and the early historic period is something that archaeologists have been trying to explain for decades, without reaching a consensus. Disease is the most commonly invoked explanation, and it is certainly plausible. European diseases, including smallpox, measles, and influenza, spread ahead of European physical presence, often by decades, moving through indigenous trade and social networks. The Ozarks were connected to the Mississippi Valley trade networks, and those networks were certainly penetrated by European diseases at some point in the 16th century. But disease alone does not fully account for the patterns in the Ozark archaeological record. The abandonment of some sites and the continuation of others, the shifting of populations to specific valley bottoms and away from the uplands, the apparent consolidation of communities that in earlier periods had been more dispersed, these patterns suggest processes more complex than a simple population collapse from disease. Political disruption, warfare, climate stress during the medieval warm period and its aftermath, and changes in the regional trade networks all appear to have played roles that are not yet fully sorted out from each other in the archaeological record. The oral traditions of the indigenous peoples who were in the Ozarks at the time of European contact, primarily the Osage and the Caddo-speaking peoples of the Arkansas River Valley, contain references to earlier peoples who occupied the land before them and who left things behind that the later occupants found and wondered about. These references are sometimes vague and sometimes specific, but they consistently point to a picture of deep historical layering in the Ozark region, of peoples coming and going and leaving traces that were already old when the next group arrived. The Osage, who were the dominant indigenous group in the Ozarks at the time of sustained European contact, maintained an elaborate cosmological system and a tradition of oral history that encoded information about their movements and their relationships to the landscape. Their accounts of the Ozark region include references to sacred sites, to underground spaces, to bodies of water with specific properties, and to places where things happened in the past that left marks on the land that could still be perceived by those who knew how to look. The relationship between Osage oral tradition and the archaeological record of the Ozarks has been studied, but not thoroughly enough to resolve the major questions. The French, who were the first Europeans to establish sustained contact with the peoples of the Ozark region, left accounts of the landscape and its inhabitants that are extraordinary in their detail. and in what they imply about the state of the region in the 17th and early 18th centuries. The expeditions of Marquette and Joliet in 1672, La Salle in 1682, and the subsequent French colonial explorations of the Arkansas and Missouri River valleys produced records that archaeologists and historians have been mining for evidence about pre-contact and early contact indigenous societies ever since. What those records consistently show is a region that was in a state of flux. Populations that had been large in earlier periods were reduced. Sites that had been occupied were now empty or lightly used. The political configurations of the early historic period, with the Osage dominant in the central and northern Ozarks and various Caddo-speaking groups along the southern and western margins, were not necessarily ancient arrangements. They may have been the result of relatively recent reorganizations following whatever disruptions had reduced the earlier populations. The French accounts also contain specific references to physical features of the Ozark landscape that have intrigued researchers ever since. Father Jacques Marquette, in his account of the journey down the Mississippi in 1673, described earthworks visible from the river that sound like Mississippian mounds. Later, French explorers described springs with unusual properties, cave systems of great extent, and deposits of minerals including galena, a lead ore that the indigenous peoples valued highly. The galena is particularly interesting because it appears in archaeological sites across the eastern United States as a trade item, and the Ozarks are one of the primary sources of galena in the entire region. The lead deposits of the southeastern Missouri Ozarks, in what is now the old lead belt, were among the most productive lead deposits in North America, and they were being extracted and traded by indigenous peoples long before European contact. Galena appears in Hopewell sites, in Mississippian sites, and in the earliest European contact sites, in quantities that imply organized extraction and distribution. The scale of pre-contact galena extraction in the Ozarks has never been fully assessed because mining in the historic period destroyed or obscured much of the evidence of earlier activity. But what evidence remains suggests that the Ozark Lead District was a major regional resource that drew traders and travelers to the region for centuries before European contact. The French colonial period in the Ozarks produced something that is rarely discussed in standard histories but that is archaeologically significant: a series of mining and trading operations in the southeastern Missouri Ozarks that provide some of the earliest documented examples of European extraction of Ozark mineral resources. The French established a mining operation at Mine La Motte in Madison County, Missouri, around 1715, making it one of the earliest sustained mineral extraction operations in what is now the continental United States west of the Appalachians. What the French found when they began extracting lead from the Ozark deposits was evidence that they were not the first people to have had this idea. Indigenous peoples had been extracting galena from these deposits for centuries, leaving behind the physical evidence of their work in the form of excavations, fire-setting residues, and concentrations of lithic debris around the outcrop areas. The scale of pre-contact indigenous mining in the Ozark Lead District has been estimated at various levels by different researchers, but all estimates are substantial. This was not casual collection of surface material. It was organized extraction from specific deposits, using techniques that were effective and that had been refined over a long period of practice. The lead extracted from Ozark sources appears at sites spanning the entirety of the Hopewell and Mississippian periods across a geographic range that covers much of eastern North America. Someone was organizing that distribution. Someone was making decisions about where the material went and in what quantities. And the center of that organizational capacity was the Ozark Lead District itself, which sat in the middle of the continent at the intersection of the major river systems that connected the eastern United States. The role of the Ozarks as a supplier of critical materials to the continental exchange networks of pre-Columbian North America is a story that has been told in pieces by archaeologists working on specific time periods and specific materials, but has not been assembled into a coherent account that the general public has access to. The pieces, when assembled, suggest that the Ozarks were not a backwater. They were a resource zone of continental significance, connected to major centers of power and exchange in all directions, and occupied by peoples who were sophisticated enough to manage those connections effectively over very long periods of time. That story is largely invisible in popular accounts of American history, which tend to focus on the mound centers of the Mississippi Valley and the Southwest, and to treat the Ozarks as an afterthought. There are structures in the Ozarks that do not fit any known archaeological category. Not comfortably, anyway. Researchers who encounter them tend to describe them carefully and then move on, because making strong claims about things that do not fit is not generally a good career move in academic archaeology. But the structures exist, and enough researchers have described them in enough publications over enough decades that they cannot simply be explained away. The most widespread category is dry-laid stone walls. Throughout the Ozark uplands, across Missouri and Arkansas, and into the adjacent portions of Oklahoma and Kansas, there are stone walls built without mortar that run for considerable distances across the landscape. Some of these walls are obviously of European or Euro-American origin, farm field boundaries built by settlers in the 19th and early 20th centuries, but others are in locations and configurations that do not support a 19th century agricultural explanation, and their style of construction is in some cases different from typical Euro-American dry-stack field walls. Some of these walls are built on ridgetops with no obvious agricultural function. Some are in areas that were never significantly farmed. Some appear to predate the settler period based on their degree of lichen growth, their integration with mature vegetation, and the presence of archaeological deposits underneath and around them. The problem with stone walls as archaeological features is that they are extremely difficult to date without associated materials, and stone walls tend not to produce the organic materials that allow radiocarbon dating. So the standard archaeological response to an ambiguous stone wall is caution, and caution sometimes becomes inertia. And inertia means the walls remain undated and undocumented in the formal sense, known to local people and to hikers who come across them, but not entered into the formal record in a way that would prompt systematic investigation. This is a pattern that repeats across Ozark archaeology. The formal record is substantially smaller than the informal knowledge base. What researchers know from survey and excavation is substantially smaller than what locals know from lifetimes of moving through the landscape. And what locals know from lifetimes of moving through the landscape is substantially larger than what anyone has found a way to integrate into the formal archaeological picture. Among the stone wall sites that have received some formal attention, the most interesting are those in the northern Arkansas Ozarks, particularly in the counties bordering the Buffalo River. Survey work in this region has documented stone alignments and enclosures that appear to predate European settlement and that have no obvious functional parallel in the known archaeological sequence for the area. Some of these features have been described as possible garden beds or cultivation terraces, an interpretation that would connect them to the late prehistoric intensification of agriculture in the region. Others have been described as possible windbreaks, storage facilities, or boundary markers. None of these interpretations is fully satisfying, and researchers who have spent time with these features in the field tend to express more uncertainty about their origin and function than their published descriptions might suggest. There are also, in several locations in the Ozarks, what appear to be stone pits or chambers, roughly rectangular or circular excavations lined with dry-laid stone that are too small to be habitation structures but too large and too carefully constructed to be simple storage pits. These features are known primarily from local accounts and from the records of early surveyors and land agents who encountered them in the 19th century. Their current status in most cases is unknown, either destroyed by later development or simply unlocated in the formal survey record. The early surveyors who described them were not archaeologists and did not provide the kind of detailed documentation that would allow them to be properly assessed, but their descriptions are consistent enough across different individuals and different locations to suggest that these were real features of the landscape, rather than misidentifications or inventions. The question of who built these structures, and when, and for what purpose, is one that formal archaeology has not been in a position to answer because the features have not been formally excavated or dated. The informal consensus among people who know the region well is that some of these stone features are indigenous in origin, built before European contact. But that consensus is not based on systematic evidence. It is based on a combination of location, style, and the absence of any plausible alternative explanation, which is not nothing, but it is also not the kind of evidence that resolves questions. There is also a class of Ozark archaeological site that has received more formal attention but that remains poorly understood: the ceremonial stone mound. Unlike the earthen platform mounds that characterize the major Mississippian centers, the ceremonial stone mounds of the Ozarks are built from rock rather than earth, taking advantage of the abundant surface stone that the limestone plateau provides. These features are documented primarily in the northern Arkansas Ozarks and in adjacent parts of southern Missouri. They range in size from small stone piles a few feet across to larger structures measuring 20 or 30 feet in diameter and several feet in height. They have been found to contain, in some cases, human burials accompanied by grave goods that date to the woodland and early Mississippian periods. The stone mound mortuary tradition appears to be a regional variant of the broader woodland burial mound tradition, adapted to the lithic resources of the Ozark uplands. But some stone mounds in the Ozarks do not contain burials, or at least have not been found to contain burials in the excavations that have been conducted, and their function is less clear. Some may be the result of agricultural field clearing, which would make them entirely mundane. Others appear to be deliberately shaped and positioned in ways that suggest intentional placement in the landscape rather than casual accumulation. The distinction between a stone pile created by a farmer clearing a field and a ceremonial feature created by a community for ritual purposes is not always obvious in the field, and archaeologists have been inconsistent in how they approach this distinction. The result is that the formal record of stone mound sites in the Ozarks almost certainly includes both types, without always clearly distinguishing between them. The landscape itself, in the Ozarks, has a quality that people who spend time there consistently describe in similar terms. It is old in a way that is perceptible. The hollows hold darkness longer than seems reasonable. The bluffs have a presence that is hard to characterize, but that multiple independent observers remark on. The rivers, particularly the older ones like the Buffalo and the Current and the 11 Point, move through a country that looks like it has not changed since before human memory. This is partly an objective geological fact. The Ozarks are one of the oldest continuously exposed landmasses in North America, and parts of the region have not been significantly disturbed by either glaciation or major tectonic activity for hundreds of millions of years. But the feeling that people report is not just a response to abstract geological age. It is a response to something more immediate, something about the specific texture of the landscape, in the hollows and on the bluffs and along the rivers, that creates a sense of depth and duration that the mind interprets as presence. The indigenous peoples who lived in the Ozarks for thousands of years clearly felt this too. The density of sacred sites in the region, the number of caves and springs and rock outcrops that have been identified through archaeological and documentary evidence as places of ritual significance, is substantially higher than would be expected in a landscape that was simply being used for subsistence purposes. The Ozarks were not just lived in. They were read, interpreted, and engaged with as a complex environment that was simultaneously physical and spiritual, material and meaningful. That engagement left traces in the landscape that are still visible to those who know how to look, and it produced a body of knowledge about the specific properties of specific places that was accumulated over thousands of years, and that was disrupted but not entirely destroyed by the events of the colonial period. What survives of that knowledge is held by the descendants of the peoples who accumulated it, and it represents a dimension of the Ozark story that academic archaeology has been slow to incorporate into its frameworks. The Osage Nation, whose traditional territory included the Ozarks, and whose oral traditions encode information about the landscape that goes back centuries before European contact, has been engaged in a process of cultural revitalization and documentation that has produced new understanding of the region's pre-contact history. Osage scholars and knowledge keepers have been working with archaeologists and historians to integrate oral tradition with material evidence in ways that produce a richer and more accurate picture of the past than either source alone provides. This work is ongoing, and it is producing results that are reshaping the standard account of Ozark prehistory. But it is work that takes time, and that requires relationships of trust and respect that are not built quickly. And the results, when they do emerge, often reveal that the standard account was missing not minor details but major elements of the picture. The springs of the Ozarks were not just practical resources, they were sacred places. The volume and constancy of the water discharging from major Ozark springs, the fact that they continue to flow even in dry seasons when surface streams run low or dry up entirely, made them extraordinary features of the landscape to people for whom water was the most fundamental resource. The chemistry of the water in many Ozark springs, which can include dissolved minerals that give it distinctive tastes, smells, and sometimes colors, added to the sense that these were special places where the underground world communicated with the surface world. The medicinal properties attributed to mineral springs, which led to the development of spa resorts at sites like Eureka Springs, Arkansas, and Siloam Springs. Arkansas in the 19th century were almost certainly recognized and utilized by indigenous peoples long before European contact. Archaeological survey around major springs in the Ozarks has consistently found evidence of occupation and activity that spans long periods, from Paleo-Indian times through the historic period. The springs were not just convenient camping spots. They were focal points in the landscape that drew people back repeatedly over centuries and millennia. In the formal sense, they are some of the most continuously occupied places in the Ozarks. In the informal sense, they are some of the places that people consistently describe as having a quality that goes beyond their physical properties. Visitors to the major Ozark springs, even visitors with no particular interest in archaeology or indigenous history, often report a sense that the place has been noticed for a long time, that the particular combination of the water and the rock and the vegetation has been registered by minds other than their own and across time periods that the mind resists estimating. This is not a claim about the supernatural. It is a claim about the quality of attention that human beings apply to places that are genuinely unusual, and about the way in which the accumulated attention of many generations of observers can leave a mark on a place that later observers can perceive without knowing its source. The Ozarks are full of such places. The springs are the most obvious examples, but the caves are another category, the river bluffs are another, and the ridge tops with their long views across the plateau are another. The pattern is consistent enough that it is hard to dismiss as coincidence. The places that feel significant in the Ozarks tend, when investigated, to have evidence of long human use. The places that feel unremarkable tend, when investigated, to have less of that evidence. This correlation is not perfect, but it is strong enough to be worth taking seriously. It suggests that something about the quality of these places registered on human perceptions in ways that were consistent across long periods of time and across different cultural frameworks. What that something is, exactly, is a question that the physical sciences can address only partially. The springs have measurable chemical and hydrological properties. The caves have measurable acoustic properties. The bluffs have measurable visual and microclimatic properties. But the sense that these places produce in human observers is more than the sum of those measurable properties, and the history of human engagement with them is more than can be accounted for by the practical utility they provided. This is not mysticism. It is a recognition that the relationship between human beings and their landscapes is complex, that places can have properties that science has not yet learned to measure, and that the accumulated experience of thousands of years of observation by attentive people is a form of knowledge that deserves respect even when it resists formalization. One of the most interesting and least discussed aspects of Ozark archaeology is the evidence for ancient roads and trails. The indigenous peoples of the eastern United States built and maintained an extensive network of trails that connected settlements, ceremonial sites, and resource areas across the landscape. Some of these trails have been identified through documentary sources, particularly the accounts of early European travelers who followed existing trails into the interior. Others have been identified through the analysis of settlement patterns, which show consistent relationships between site locations and the presumed routes of major trails. Still others have been identified through the physical evidence of trail formation itself, the compaction of soil, the removal of surface vegetation, and in some cases the construction of drainage features that indicate long-term intensive use. In the Ozarks, the trail network appears to have been particularly well developed in certain areas. The river valleys provided natural corridors for movement, and the bluff edges above the rivers provided high ground routes that offered visibility and defensibility, along with reasonable traveling conditions. The connections between these valley and ridge routes created a network that allowed movement through the Ozark interior along lines of least resistance, avoiding the worst of the broken terrain while maintaining connections between the major river systems. The Osage Trace, which connected Osage villages in the central Missouri Ozarks with the Arkansas River Valley and with trading connections to the west, is the best documented of these routes in the historic period. But similar routes connecting similar destinations appear to have existed for much longer, going back into the pre-contact period when the same connections between the same resource areas and the same exchange networks would have required the same kinds of movement through the same landscape. The physical remnants of some of these older routes have been identified by surveyors and archaeologists in the form of worn depressions in ridgeline soils, concentrations of artifact material along consistent alignments, and the locations of waterhole sites and camp spots that appear on historical maps and that have archaeological evidence of repeated use. The full extent and structure of the pre-contact trail network in the Ozarks has never been systematically documented. It is a project that would require combining documentary sources, archaeological data, satellite and aerial imagery, LiDAR terrain analysis, and ground truth verification across a very large geographic area. The tools to do this work have become available only in the last decade or so, and the application of those tools to the Ozark Trail network is still in its early stages. But the preliminary results of LiDAR surveys in several parts of the Ozarks have already produced surprises, revealing landscape modifications and alignments that were not visible in standard aerial or satellite imagery, and that suggests a level of landscape engineering in the pre-contact Ozarks that the standard accounts do not acknowledge. The LiDAR evidence deserves extended discussion because it represents one of the genuinely new frontiers in Ozark archaeology, and because what it is revealing challenges some basic assumptions about what pre-contact indigenous peoples in the region were doing. LiDAR, which stands for light detection and ranging, is a remote sensing technology that uses laser pulses to measure the precise distance to surfaces, allowing the construction of extremely detailed three-dimensional models of the terrain. When applied to forested areas, it can strip away the vegetation in the digital model and reveal the bare ground surface underneath, making visible landscape features that are completely hidden under forest canopy. The application of LiDAR to Maya sites in Central America has revealed vast cities and agricultural systems that were completely unknown before the surveys were conducted, fundamentally revising the understanding of the scale and complexity of Maya civilization. Similar work is now being done across the eastern United States, including in parts of the Ozarks, and the results are beginning to come in. What the LiDAR surveys of Ozark areas conducted in the past decade have found includes earthen ridges and berms that are not on any map of known archaeological features, stone alignments running along ridgelines that appear more regular than natural geological formations would produce, depressions arranged in patterns that do not match either natural geological processes or post-contact agricultural activity, and what appear to be ancient roadbeds following consistent alignments across multiple miles of forested terrain. None of this has been fully analyzed and published yet. The work is ongoing, and responsible researchers are correctly cautious about making strong claims on the basis of preliminary LiDAR analysis without ground truthing and associated dating. But the fact that LiDAR is finding things in the Ozarks that were not previously in the formal record is significant in itself. It tells us that the formal record is incomplete, that we have been missing things, and that what we have been missing may be substantial. The Spanish exploration of the interior of North America in the 16th century produced records that are fragmentary, sometimes unreliable, and almost always filtered through the particular interests and limitations of the people who wrote them. The Hernando de Soto expedition of 1540 to 1543 is the most extensive and best documented of the early Spanish penetrations of the interior, and its route through the southeastern United States and into Arkansas has been the subject of intensive historical and archaeological debate for over a century. The consensus route for the expedition, as established by the De Soto Commission in the 1930s and subsequently revised by later scholarship, has the expedition passing through parts of Arkansas and possibly approaching the southwestern margins of the Ozark Plateau before turning south and eventually reaching the Mississippi River again near the mouth of the Arkansas. The accounts of the expedition written by participants, particularly the accounts by the Gentleman of Elvas and by Luis de Biedma, describe indigenous settlements in the Arkansas River Valley and its tributaries that were substantial, with large populations and extensive agricultural production. They also describe a landscape and a political geography that have been mapped, imperfectly, onto the known archaeological sites of the region. What those accounts do not describe, but what their absence may imply, is that the interior Ozarks were already less densely populated in 1540 than they had been in earlier periods. The expedition moved through the most populated areas it could find, seeking food, labor, and potential wealth. If the interior Ozarks were already depopulated or only lightly occupied by 1540, the expedition would have had no reason to enter them, and its route would naturally have followed the more densely occupied river valleys at the margins of the plateau. The diseases introduced by the De Soto expedition, which historians now believe spread far in advance of the Spanish physical presence through indigenous trade networks, may have already been having catastrophic effects on Ozark populations by the time the expedition was recorded passing through adjacent areas. Epidemic disease does not respect geographic or political boundaries. A smallpox epidemic beginning in coastal populations could move hundreds of miles through interior trade networks within a few years, reaching populations that had no direct contact with Europeans. The timing of the major epidemics relative to the known abandonment of sites in the Ozark region is difficult to establish, precisely because the radiocarbon dating resolution for the relevant period is not fine enough to distinguish events, separated by decades. But the general correlation is close enough to be taken seriously. Some Ozark sites that show evidence of occupation through the 14th century do not have clear evidence of continued occupation into the 15th and 16th centuries. This could reflect population decline from disease. It could reflect movement to other locations. It could reflect changes in site use that the archaeological record is capturing imperfectly. The honest answer is that the mechanisms and timeline of Ozark depopulation in the period between roughly 1400 CE and the early historic period are not established. What is established is that the region was more densely occupied in the Mississippian period than it was at the time of sustained European contact, and that the transition between those two states involved processes that are incompletely understood. The Spanish did make one additional significant attempt to document the interior of North America in the decades after De Soto, the expedition of Juan de Oñate, which explored the southern Great Plains in 1600 CE, produced accounts that contain references to indigenous peoples in the southern Ozark margin. The expedition of Juan Pardo in the 1560s, which explored the interior of the southeast from the Carolina coast, produced accounts that have been used by archaeologists to reconstruct indigenous political geography in the area east of the Ozarks, and the various Spanish colonial enterprises in northern New Spain, which extended into Texas and Oklahoma, produced documentary evidence of indigenous peoples who had connections to groups in the Ozark region. None of this documentation amounts to a comprehensive picture of the Ozarks in the contact period, but collectively it suggests that the region was inhabited by peoples who were in communication with neighbors in all directions and who were coping, as indigenous peoples throughout North America were coping during this period, with the demographic and political disruptions that followed the initial penetration of European diseases into the continent. The French colonial period in the Ozarks, which began in earnest in the late 17th century and continued through the mid-18th century, produced documentation of the region that is richer and more systematic than the Spanish accounts. The French were primarily interested in the Ozarks as a source of furs and minerals, and their relationships with the indigenous peoples of the region were structured around trade rather than conquest, at least initially. The Osage, who were the dominant group in the central and northern Ozarks by the time of sustained French contact, proved to be effective and often demanding trading partners. The French records of their interactions with the Osage constitute one of the primary documentary sources for early historic Ozark history, and they reveal a society that was complex, politically sophisticated, and deeply connected to the landscape of the plateau in ways that went far beyond simple resource use. The Osage cosmological system, which has been documented through the work of anthropologist Francis Lafleche and his collaborators in the early 20th century, is one of the most elaborate and philosophically sophisticated indigenous cosmological systems documented in North America. It organized all of the major activities of Osage life, from warfare to diplomacy to hunting to the structure of villages, around a framework of cosmic principles expressed through ritual and ceremony. The landscape of the Ozarks figured importantly in this framework, not as a backdrop to human activity but as a participant in it, as a partner that the Osage were in relationship with, and that required specific kinds of attention and reciprocity to maintain that relationship in a productive state. The specific places in the Ozarks that were significant in the Osage cosmological system, the springs, the cave systems, the prominent bluffs, the watercourses with specific histories, were not just symbolically significant in an abstract sense. They were practically significant in the sense that the Osage interacted with them in specific ways at specific times as part of maintaining the proper relationship between the human community and the landscape. This is a form of landscape knowledge that took generations to develop and that encoded information about the specific properties of specific places that would otherwise have been lost. The disruption of that knowledge system by the process of forced removal, which relocated most of the Osage from the Ozarks to Indian Territory in the early 19th century, represents a loss of landscape knowledge that cannot be fully recovered, but that Osage scholars and knowledge keepers have been working to document and preserve in whatever form remains accessible. The Osage removal is itself a part of the Ozark story that is rarely told in connection with the archaeological and pre-contact history of the region. It represents the latest in a long series of disruptions to the human communities that have been living in the Ozarks for thousands of years, and it produced consequences that are still being worked through in the present. The Osage Nation, based in Oklahoma since the removal period, maintains cultural and historical connections to the Ozark landscape that are expressed through oral tradition, ceremonial practice, and an ongoing engagement with the material record of their ancestors' presence in the region. Archaeological sites in the Ozarks that contain Osage period material culture are, under federal law, subject to consultation with the Osage Nation about their treatment and interpretation. This consultation process, when done well, produces better archaeology. It brings knowledge to the interpretation of sites that cannot be derived from the material record alone, and it provides a check on interpretations that may be technically accurate about the material culture, but that miss or misrepresent the human context in which that culture was produced. What the Osage experience in the Ozarks also illustrates, in a way that is relevant to the longer pre-contact history of the region, is the degree to which the standard American historical narrative tends to frame indigenous peoples as peripheral to the main story. In the case of the Ozarks, the main story is presented as the European settlement of the interior, the development of mining and agriculture, and the eventual integration of the region into the American national economy. The indigenous peoples appear in this story primarily as obstacles or as background color, not as the primary agents of a long and complex history that was already ancient when European contact began. Reversing that framing, putting the 10,000 or more years of indigenous history of the Ozarks at the center of the story rather than at the margins, changes the picture fundamentally. It reveals a region that was far from a wilderness or an empty landscape when Europeans arrived. It was a landscape that had been shaped, managed, used, and understood by human communities for millennia, a landscape that bore the marks of all those millennia in its soils and its sites, and its springs and its caves and its trails. The European settlement of the Ozarks was not a development of a wilderness. It was the replacement of one complex human system with another, a replacement that erased or obscured most of the evidence of what had come before, and that created the impression of an original emptiness that never existed. The downstream consequences of the Osage removal for the material record of the Ozarks are significant. When the Osage left the region in the 1820s and 30s, they left behind villages, ceremonial sites, and a landscape that had been actively managed according to Osage principles for at least several centuries. The settlers who came in behind the removal did not, in most cases, recognize or value the management practices they inherited. They saw an untouched wilderness rather than a managed landscape, and they proceeded to use it as if it were one. The fire management practices that the Osage had used to maintain the open woodlands and savannas that characterized the pre-removal Ozark landscape were discontinued, allowing forest succession to proceed in areas that had been maintained as open ground for centuries. The springs that had been cared for as sacred sites became sources of water power for mills and eventually were channeled, diverted, and in some cases contaminated by agricultural and industrial use. The caves that had been visited for ceremonial purposes became tourist attractions, commercial saltpeter mines, and in some cases dumping grounds. The stone features that had been part of the Osage and pre-Osage landscape became obstacles to be cleared or curiosities to be looted. This trajectory is not unique to the Ozarks. It is the standard story of what happens to indigenous landscapes when the communities that manage them are removed and replaced by people who do not share the knowledge base that the management required. But the Ozarks experienced this transition in a particularly compressed form, over a period of 2 or 3 generations, and the physical evidence of the pre-removal landscape has survived better in some parts of the region than in others, depending on the degree to which the subsequent land use disrupted the surface. The Buffalo River watershed in northern Arkansas, now protected as a national river, contains some of the best preserved examples of the pre-contact and early historic Ozark landscape in the region. The deep hollows and high bluffs of the Buffalo country protected the archaeological record from much of the disturbance that affected more accessible areas, and the establishment of the National River in 1972 has provided ongoing protection. Survey and excavation in the Buffalo River watershed over the past 40 years has produced a picture of pre-contact land use in the northern Arkansas Ozarks that is substantially more complex and more intensive than the standard accounts suggest. The watershed contains evidence of occupation from the Dalton period through the Mississippian, with particularly strong evidence for woodland period use of the bluff shelters along the river, and for Mississippian period use of the valley bottomlands. The bluff dweller sites of the Buffalo River area, which were systematically looted by collectors in the early 20th century, and which produced the extraordinary collections of perishable materials that now reside in museums across the country, represent only the most visible layer of a much longer and more complex archaeological sequence. Below the bluff dweller deposits at many sites there are earlier materials going back several thousand years, and the relationship between different periods of use at the same locations tells a story of places that were returned to repeatedly over very long spans of time, not because there was nowhere else to go, but because these specific places had qualities that made them worth returning to. The rivers themselves, in the Ozarks, are different from rivers in most of the rest of the continent. They run clear over gravel bars even in periods of high water, because the Ozark soils are thin and stony and do not produce the heavy sediment loads that muddy the rivers of the surrounding plains and lowlands. They cut through the limestone in deep valleys that open into wide, gravelly bottoms in some places and narrow between towering bluffs in others. They create a specific kind of enclosed, intimate landscape in the hollows, a landscape where the scale of things is human rather than overwhelming, where the rock walls on either side of the river provide shelter and resource and define space in a way that encourages human settlement. The Ozark rivers were the highways of the pre-contact world in the region. They provided water, fish, mussels, waterfowl, and the plants that grow in rich bottomland soils. They provided routes for travel that bypassed the worst of the broken upland terrain. They provided the ecological diversity that comes from the meeting of aquatic and terrestrial environments, a diversity that made them among the most resource-rich environments in the region. And they provided the kind of shelter and intimacy that encouraged long-term settlement and the accumulation of the landscape knowledge that sustained communities over generations. The archaeological record of the Ozark rivers is extensive, better documented in some drainages than others, but consistently showing occupation going back to the earliest periods and continuing with varying intensity through the contact period and into the historic era. The rivers were the places where people chose to live, and the evidence of that choice is embedded in the valley soils in the form of middens and hearths and artifact concentrations and structural remains that span the full range of the human occupation of the region. Pulling out what those river bottom sites have to tell us about the pre-contact history of the Ozarks requires the kind of systematic, long-term research program that has not always been available for the region. But where that research has been done, the results are consistently surprising in their richness and complexity. The picture that emerges is of a region that was not marginal or peripheral in the broader sweep of North American prehistory, but that was central in specific ways that the standard accounts have not adequately captured. The biology of the Ozarks is strange in ways that parallel its archaeology. The region is what biologists call a refugium, a place where species survived the climate changes of the Pleistocene that eliminated them from most of the rest of their range. During the Ice Age, the Ozarks were cold and dry but not glaciated. They retained habitats that were eliminated or severely diminished elsewhere, and the species that lived in those habitats survived in the Ozarks when they could not survive in most of the surrounding landscape. When the climate warmed at the end of the Ice Age and the surrounding landscape changed dramatically, many of those refugial species were stranded. The surrounding habitat that had connected them to other populations of their kind disappeared, and they became isolated within the Ozarks, cut off from the broader continental populations of their species by changed vegetation, changed climate, or the simple geography of a plateau surrounded by rivers and lowlands that act as barriers to movement for many organisms. The result of this process, operating over the past 10 to 12,000 years, is a biological landscape of remarkable distinctiveness. The Ozarks contain more endemic species found only in the Ozarks and nowhere else on Earth, than any other part of the interior North American continent. The cave systems alone support dozens of endemic invertebrate species, blind and unpigmented creatures that have spent thousands of generations adapting to the perpetual darkness and the specific chemistry of Ozark groundwater. The spring systems support endemic fish, crayfish, snails, and aquatic invertebrates that exist nowhere else. The upland forests contain endemic plant species that found refuge in the Ozarks during the climatic extremes of the Pleistocene and that have not been able to recolonize the surrounding territory since. This biological richness is not just an interesting footnote. It is direct evidence of the deep history of the Ozark landscape as a place that maintained continuity through periods of radical change in the surrounding world. A refugium is, by definition, a place that stayed similar enough to what it had been to allow the survival of things that could not survive the changes happening elsewhere. The Ozarks were that place for a substantial diversity of organisms during the Pleistocene, and they have been that place for some of those organisms ever since. What the biology is telling us, in other words, is that the Ozarks have a quality of deep continuity that extends back through geological time, and that is registered in the living organisms of the region as well as in the rock beneath them. This is the same quality that people report experiencing in the landscape, and it is the same quality that the archaeological record reflects in the long spans of continuous human occupation at specific sites. The biology, the geology, the archaeology, and the phenomenology of the Ozark experience are all pointing at the same underlying feature of the landscape, an extraordinary depth of continuity that distinguishes the Ozarks from the surrounding territory, and that has shaped everything that has happened here for millions of years. The cave biology deserves particular attention because it is one of the aspects of the Ozarks that most clearly demonstrates the consequences of long isolation. The cave fauna of the Ozarks includes some of the most specialized organisms in North America. Blind cavefish, particularly the grotto sculpin and the Ozark cavefish, have evolved through the loss of functional eyes over the course of their long isolation in the underground environment. Their ancestors entered the caves thousands of years ago with functional eyes, and in the permanent darkness of the cave environment, where eyes provide no advantage and the energy required to develop and maintain them is metabolically costly, the selective pressure for functional vision was relaxed, and mutations that eliminated or reduced the eye structures were neutral or advantageous. Over many generations, the cave-adapted populations lost their functional eyes entirely. The same process eliminated the pigmentation that would have made them visible to predators in surface environments, rendering them pale and almost translucent. These cave-adapted species are biologically isolated from their surface relatives. The cave populations cannot interbreed with surface populations because they are physically separated by the cave environment, and because the cave conditions that they are adapted to would be lethal to surface forms that lack their specific adaptations. They are in the process of becoming, if they are not already, separate species. The time required for this level of divergence from surface forms is estimated at thousands to tens of thousands of years, depending on the species and the specific genetic markers used for the comparison. This means that some of the cave-adapted species of the Ozarks have been isolated in their underground habitats for as long as, or longer than, human beings have been living in the region. They are, in a sense, contemporaries of the Paleo-Indian peoples who were making Dalton points in the Ozark uplands 10,000 years ago, contemporaries who have been living in an entirely different world from the one on the surface for that entire time. The cave systems that house these remarkable organisms are also the cave systems that human beings have been using for ritual and habitation purposes for millennia. The connection between human use of caves and the presence of this extraordinary biological community is not coincidental. The same features of the Ozark karst that created conditions suitable for the evolution of highly specialized cave organisms, deep darkness, stable temperature, high humidity, connection to extensive groundwater systems, also created conditions that made the caves valuable to human beings for specific purposes. The caves were cool in summer and warm in winter relative to the surface environment. They provided shelter from weather and from predators. They provided access to water through underground streams and drips. And they provided the kind of darkness and enclosure that human beings have consistently used for ritual purposes throughout the world. The human use of Ozark caves and the biological specialization of Ozark cave fauna are parallel consequences of the same geological and ecological features of the region, features that have been shaping the Ozarks for millions of years. The surface biology of the Ozarks is equally distinctive, though in less dramatic ways. The flora of the Ozark uplands includes species that are more characteristic of the southern Appalachians than of the surrounding mid-continent, relict populations that have survived in the Ozarks since a period when the two regions were ecologically connected. There are orchid species, fern species, and a variety of other plants in the Ozarks that seem out of place given the surrounding landscape and that reflect the refugial history of the plateau. The forests of the Ozarks are structurally and compositionally different from the forests of the surrounding regions, with a mix of species that reflects both the rocky, thin-soiled upland environment and the refugial history of the region. Old-growth forest, in the technical sense of forest that has not been significantly disturbed by logging or agriculture, is rare in the Ozarks as it is rare throughout the eastern United States. But patches of old growth survive in the most inaccessible hollows and on the steepest bluff faces, places where logging was not economically practical, and these patches provide a glimpse of what the Ozark forest looked like before European contact. The old growth patches of the Ozarks tend to be biologically rich in ways that recently logged or second growth forests are not, supporting populations of species that cannot establish in disturbed habitats and that require the specific structural complexity that old growth provides. They are also, not coincidentally, the places in the Ozarks where the sense of depth and continuity that people report in the landscape is strongest. The old-growth forest in the deepest hollows of the Buffalo River watershed, the ancient trees on the bluff faces above the current river, the unlogged patches in the most remote corners of the Mark Twain and Ozark National Forests. These are the places where the biological and the experiential quality of the Ozark landscape converge most powerfully. They are also the places that are most likely to contain the undisturbed archaeological deposits that would provide the clearest picture of the pre-contact human history of the region, because they are the places where post-contact disturbance has been least severe. The ecological health of the Ozarks is unevenly distributed, reflecting the geography of land ownership and land use history that developed following European settlement. The areas that were most accessible and most fertile were the most intensively farmed and logged, and they have the most disturbed ecological and archaeological records. The areas that were least accessible and least fertile were used less intensively and have better preserved records on both counts. This pattern creates opportunities for research in the most remote and least disturbed parts of the region, but it also creates challenges because the most remote areas are also the areas that have been least systematically surveyed and about which the least is currently known. There is a kind of systematic bias in the formal archaeological and biological knowledge base for the Ozarks that underrepresents the most remote and least disturbed parts of the region in favor of the more accessible areas that have been more thoroughly studied. Correcting that bias would require sustained effort in difficult terrain, and it would likely produce results that further complicate and enrich the already complex picture of the Ozarks that research has produced to date. The Ozark cavefish, which was one of the first cavefish to be formally described in North America, offers a particular window into the deep time of the region. It is found in only a few cave systems in southern Missouri and northern Arkansas, and its population is small enough that it is listed as a vulnerable species. The springs associated with those cave systems, particularly Roaring River Spring in Missouri and several springs in the White River drainage of Arkansas, have been known to local people for generations as places of unusual character. The springs that the cavefish inhabits are not just sources of water. They are the outflows of cave systems that extend for unknown distances into the Ozark Plateau, systems that may be connected to each other through passages that have never been explored, and that may contain biological and archaeological resources that have not yet been identified. The protection of the cavefish and the protection of the archaeological record of the caves are, in this sense, related concerns. The same caves that harbour the cavefish are the same caves that indigenous peoples used for ritual purposes over long periods. The same springs that the cavefish depends on are the same springs that were focal points of indigenous landscape use. The deep history of the Ozarks, biological and human, is encoded in the same physical locations, and the preservation of that history, whether measured in species or in artifacts, depends on the preservation of those locations. This is a connection that is not often made explicitly in either the biological or the archaeological literature, but that is real, and that has practical implications for how the most significant Ozark sites are managed and protected. The aquatic diversity of the Ozarks more broadly is a measure of the ecological health and historical integrity of the region that has significant implications for understanding its deep history. The Ozarks support more species of freshwater fish than any comparable area of similar size in the interior of North America. They support extensive populations of freshwater mussels, including species that are globally rare and that depend on specific host fish for their reproduction. The water quality required to support this diversity is itself a testament to the relative intactness of the Ozark watershed in the areas where the highest diversity remains. Clear, cold, well-oxygenated water flowing over gravel and cobble substrates, maintained by the spring systems that discharge from the karst aquifers, provides the specific conditions that these organisms require and that have made the Ozarks one of the most biologically significant freshwater regions in North America. The same conditions, from a human perspective, produce what many people describe as the most beautiful rivers they have ever seen. The clarity of the Current River, the Buffalo River, the 11-Point River, and several other Ozark streams is extraordinary by any standard. These rivers are not just clean in the sense of being safe to drink. They are optically clear to depths of 15 and 20 feet, allowing the bottom to be seen clearly even in the deepest pools. The combination of this clarity with the surrounding limestone bluffs and the old-growth forest in the most protected sections creates a visual environment that is genuinely unlike anything in the surrounding landscape, and that has drawn visitors to the Ozarks for at least 200 years, since the earliest accounts of European-American travelers began describing the rivers of the region. The biological richness of the Ozarks and its deep history are directly connected to the geological stability of the region. The Ozark Plateau is not tectonically active. It does not experience significant volcanic activity. It was not glaciated. The climate has changed, sometimes dramatically, over the millennia. But the basic structure of the landscape, the plateau with its deep river valleys and its extensive karst systems, has been maintained for millions of years. This stability is what allowed the refugia to function during the Pleistocene, what allowed the cave fauna to evolve in isolation, and what allowed the spring systems to maintain the consistency of flow and chemistry that the endemic aquatic species depend on. It is also what has made the Ozarks a region where evidence of the past accumulates rather than being destroyed. When the same locations are used by human beings over many generations, as the major spring sites and cave sites of the Ozarks have been, the evidence of that use accumulates in layers that can be read, if the excavation is done carefully, as a record of the human presence in the region going back to its beginning. The deep stability of the Ozark landscape has made it, in a sense, a natural archive of both biological and human history, an archive that is only beginning to be systematically read, and that contains far more than has yet been extracted from it. There is a category of Ozark history that sits in an uncomfortable middle zone between the formally documented and the informally known. It consists of accounts by travelers, surveyors, settlers, and local observers from the 18th and 19th centuries that describe things in the Ozark landscape that do not match what the standard archaeological and historical accounts say should be there. These accounts are not the lurid nonsense of tabloid archaeology. They are matter-of-fact descriptions of physical features encountered in the course of ordinary activities, recorded by people who had no particular reason to invent what they were describing, and no particular theoretical framework for interpreting it. They are the kind of accounts that accumulate in the footnotes of regional histories and the back pages of county historical society publications and the personal papers of surveyors and land agents, accounts that researchers encounter and note and then file because they do not know what to do with them. Assembling these accounts across multiple sources and multiple decades begins to produce a pattern that is harder to dismiss than any individual account would be. One of the most consistent threads in these accounts is the description of cut stone, not the fieldstone dry-laid walls that were common features of Ozark settlement agriculture, but something that multiple independent observers across different time periods describe as cut or dressed, meaning intentionally shaped by tools rather than simply stacked in its natural form. The accounts describe dressed stone in contexts that do not support a European or Euro-American origin. In the depths of cave systems that had not been commercially developed, on ridgetops far from any road or settlement, in association with other features or materials that appeared old. The language of these accounts is generally careful and observational, rather than speculative. The observers were not claiming that they had found evidence of a lost civilization. They were describing, as precisely as they could, what they had seen, and leaving the interpretation to someone else. The someone else, in most cases, never came. The accounts were filed and forgotten. The features they described were never formally investigated, and the question of what those features actually were remains open. This pattern of observation without follow-up, of documentation without investigation, is one of the structural problems in Ozark archaeological research. The region is large, the terrain is difficult, the funding for systematic survey has been limited, and the priorities of research institutions have consistently directed attention toward the more accessible and more obviously significant sites. The result is that a substantial body of observational data about potentially significant features of the Ozark landscape exists in the historical record, but has not been translated into formal archaeological investigation. Whether that investigation, if conducted, would confirm that the observed features are significant in the ways that the original observers implied is an open question. But the fact that the investigation has not been conducted means that the question cannot be answered. One specific category of unexplained features that appears repeatedly in historical accounts of the Ozarks is what observers describe as underground rooms or chambers. These are distinct from natural cave passages in the descriptions, which consistently note that the walls and sometimes the floors of the chambers they describe are flat and regular in ways that natural cave formation does not typically produce. Some of these descriptions are almost certainly accounts of natural caves whose regular features impressed observers unfamiliar with cave geology. The constant temperature of a cave, its consistent humidity, the way water has smoothed and shaped the walls of a passage over millennia, can produce features that look strikingly regular and almost man-made to someone seeing them for the first time. But some of the accounts include details that are harder to explain as natural cave features. Right-angle corners, flat floors that have clearly been leveled rather than deposited, passages that appear to have been widened or regularized in specific sections, and in a few cases, specific objects found in the chambers that would not be present in a natural cave context. These accounts are not proof of anything. They are, as noted, observations made by people who were not archaeologists and who did not have the training to distinguish reliably between natural and modified cave features. But they are also observations that deserve to be taken seriously rather than simply set aside, because the Ozark cave systems are among the most extensive in North America, and because only a small fraction of the documented caves, let alone the undocumented ones, have been the subject of systematic archaeological investigation. The possibility that modified cave features exist in parts of the Ozark Karst that have not been systematically investigated is not far-fetched. The known evidence of deep cave ritual use in the Ozarks, the cave paintings and the artifact deposits in remote sections of documented sites, establishes that people were going deep into Ozark caves for purposes other than habitation. The modification of cave passages or chambers for ritual purposes is documented in other parts of the world. The specific form that such modification might take in the Ozark context is not known, but the possibility that it occurred cannot be dismissed on the basis of the current state of investigation. The documentary record of the Ozarks also contains a consistent thread of accounts describing earthworks that do not fit the expected pattern of woodland or Mississippian mound construction. Some of these accounts describe mounds in locations where no mounds have been formally documented. Others describe configurations of earthworks that have no parallel in the known Ozark archaeological record. Still others describe earthworks in combination with stone features in ways that suggest a pattern of site construction that is unfamiliar to researchers working within the standard frameworks. These accounts come from periods spanning the entire Euro-American settlement of the region, from the earliest surveys in the late 18th century through the mid-20th century. They come from people with different backgrounds, different levels of education, different purposes for being in the Ozarks. The consistency of the basic observations across these different sources is itself significant, even if the interpretation of those observations remains uncertain. The question of whether there are earth and stone features in the Ozarks that have not been formally documented, but that are present in the historical record and potentially still extant in the landscape, is one that LiDAR analysis is beginning to address. The same LiDAR surveys that have been revealing previously unknown landscape modifications in the Ozarks are also being used to systematically search for features that match the descriptions in historical accounts, to see whether the things people were describing in the 18th and 19th centuries are still there and can be documented in the formal record. The preliminary results are, as noted earlier, promising but not yet conclusive. The features that LiDAR is revealing need to be ground-truthed, and the ground-truthing has not yet been done at the scale required to evaluate the LiDAR findings comprehensively. But the direction of the evidence is toward a landscape that contains more archaeological complexity than the formal record currently reflects, and the historical accounts provide a body of observational data that helps guide the search for that complexity. The saltpeter mining history of the Ozarks adds another dimension to the picture of pre-contact and early contact cave use in the region. Saltpeter, or potassium nitrate, is a component of gunpowder and was therefore a critical military resource in the period from roughly the 17th through the 19th centuries. It occurs naturally in caves as a mineral deposited by the evaporation of bat guano and other organic material. The caves of the Ozarks were extensively mined for saltpeter during the War of 1812 and the Civil War, and the evidence of that mining is still visible in many caves in the form of wooden leaching vats, digging tools, and the characteristic disturbed appearance of cave soil in the sections that were mined. The saltpeter mining was destructive to the archaeological record of the caves in which it occurred, because it involved the wholesale excavation of cave sediments that had accumulated over thousands of years and that would have contained stratified evidence of earlier human use. The archaeologists who have worked in saltpeter-mined caves have to deal with the fact that the primary depositional record of the cave has been removed and the remaining evidence is scrambled. But the saltpeter mining also provides, paradoxically, some of the best documentation of pre-mining cave use in the Ozarks, because the miners encountered and sometimes documented the earlier materials they found as they excavated. The records of saltpeter mining operations in several Ozark caves include references to artifacts found in the sediments being processed, artifacts that predate the mining period by centuries or millennia. These incidental finds, recorded by people whose primary interest was in the saltpeter and not in the artifacts, constitute a secondary archaeological record for the caves in question that supplements the formal record in useful ways. They confirm that the caves being mined had been used by earlier peoples, and they provide some information about what materials those earlier peoples left behind, even though the contextual information that would allow precise dating and interpretation has been destroyed by the mining process. The broader story of extractive resource use in the Ozarks, which the saltpeter mining exemplifies, is one that connects the pre-contact history of the region to its later industrial history in ways that are not often acknowledged. The lead mining, the salt spring exploitation, the saltpeter mining, the timber extraction, and eventually the barite and zinc mining of the 19th and 20th centuries are all variations on a theme that begins in the pre-contact period with indigenous extraction of the same or similar resources. The Ozarks have been a resource zone for as long as people have been living in them, and the continuity of that resource use from the pre-contact period through the industrial era is a thread that connects the deep past to the more recent history of the region, in ways that the standard periodization of Ozark history tends to obscure. The documentary record for the 19th century in the Ozarks is substantially richer than the record for earlier periods, and it includes accounts of archaeological finds made in the course of agricultural clearing, mining, and other land development activities that provide some of the most specific evidence available for the density and distribution of the pre-contact occupation of the region. Farmers ploughing new ground regularly encountered buried archaeological materials, including ceramic sherds, lithic tools, and in some cases human remains, in quantities that suggested a much denser pre-contact population than the 19th century landscape, from which most of the indigenous population had been removed, would have implied. Mound sites that had survived into the 19th century were recorded by local observers before being destroyed by agricultural development, and some of those records provide the only documentation of sites that were significant enough to be worth describing, but that no longer exist in any form recognizable to archaeological survey. The pattern that emerges from these 19th century accounts is of an Ozark landscape that bore the marks of its pre-contact human history in ways that were visible and striking to the people who were settling it, even though most of those settlers had no framework for interpreting what they were seeing beyond the general knowledge that the land had been inhabited by Indians before them. The gravel bars of the Ozark rivers have been particularly productive sources of archaeological material for collectors and casual observers over the past 2 centuries. The rivers regularly expose buried materials as they erode their banks and rework their gravel beds, and the clear water makes surface visibility good enough that observers walking or floating the rivers frequently spot artifacts in the gravel bars and shallow areas. The collections assembled by local residents from Ozark River gravel represent a substantial body of material that is outside the formal archaeological record, but that contains information about the density and distribution of pre-contact activity along the river systems. The problem with river-collected material is that it lacks context. An artifact found on a gravel bar has been moved by river action from wherever it was originally deposited, and there is no way to determine how far it has traveled or what its original depositional context was. This makes river-collected material very difficult to use for precise interpretation, even though it can tell you something about what kinds of materials were being produced and used in the region. Some of the river-collected material from the Ozarks is extraordinary in terms of its craftsmanship and its rarity. Points made from exotic cherts not native to the immediate area. Objects made from materials that required transport from considerable distances, worked copper pieces from the old copper complex, or from Hopewell period production. Ceramic sherds with unusual decorative motifs that suggest connections to distant traditions. The fact that material of this quality and rarity turns up in the rivers of the Ozarks, even in gravel bar contexts that strip away the original depositional information, is itself significant. It tells you that the people living along these rivers had access to materials and manufactured goods from far outside the immediate region, and that they were part of exchange networks of considerable geographic scope. This is consistent with everything else the archaeology tells us about the Ozark region, and it reinforces the picture of the Ozarks as a connected, engaged participant in the broader cultural world of pre-contact North America rather than an isolated backwater. The folklore of the Ozarks has attracted sustained scholarly attention since Vance Randolph began systematically documenting it in the 1920s. Randolph, who spent most of his adult life in the Ozarks and who had the trust and access that only a long resident earns, produced a body of folklore documentation that is extraordinary in its breadth and detail. His collections of folk songs, folk beliefs, folk medicine, folk tales, and what he called superstitions cover virtually every aspect of the traditional culture of the Euro-American Ozark Hill Country, and they contain material that is relevant to the question of what the Ozarks were before European settlement, in ways that Randolph himself was not always in a position to appreciate. The folk beliefs documented by Randolph and by subsequent researchers like Otto Ernest Rayburn and Mary Celestia Parler include a consistent thread of accounts about places in the Ozark landscape that are described as old, as different, as places where something happened or where something is still present that is not explained by the history the storyteller knows. These accounts are not simply ghost stories or haunted house stories in the conventional sense, though those exist in the Ozarks in abundance. They are something more specific, accounts of places that are recognized as significant in ways that predate the current occupant's memory, places that the landscape itself seems to mark as special in some way that people register without being able to explain. The springs come up repeatedly in this category. Stories about specific springs, about their particular properties, about things that happened at springs, about the prohibitions associated with some springs, fill several volumes of the folklore record. Some of these stories can be traced to specific historical events or to specific geological or ecological properties of the springs themselves, but others contain elements that do not have obvious historical or natural explanations, and that suggest the persistence of older understandings of the landscape, older ways of relating to specific places that survived the transition from indigenous to Euro-American land use in some attenuated or transformed form. The cave traditions are similarly extensive. Stories about what lies deep in caves, about passages that go farther than anyone has followed them, about sounds that come from underground in places where there is no obvious cave entrance, about things found in caves that could not be explained. These constitute a substantial and consistent body of material in the Ozark folklore record. Some of this material is clearly the result of the dramatic acoustic properties of caves, which can carry sounds from great distances in unexpected directions, creating the impression of sources that have no physical location. Some of it reflects the genuine geological complexity of the Ozark karst, in which unexpected connections between underground passages and surface features can produce phenomena that are genuinely puzzling, and some of it, the portion that remains after the natural explanations are applied, consists of accounts that describe encounters with features or objects in the cave environment that are not easily explained by either natural process or post-contact human activity. The flood traditions of the Ozarks are particularly interesting. Multiple folkloric accounts from different parts of the region describe a period of great flooding that preceded the current landscape, a time when the valleys were filled with water and the ridgelines were islands. These stories are sometimes told as origin narratives, explaining how the current landscape came to be. They are sometimes told as memory, as accounts of something that happened in the deep past and that the storyteller is reporting as tradition rather than claiming to have witnessed. The geological record of the Ozarks does contain evidence of periods of dramatically higher water levels, not just from the Ice Age, but from periods within the Holocene, when the rivers ran at higher volumes than today, and when the valley bottoms were filled with water in ways that would have significantly restricted the habitable landscape. Whether the flood traditions of Ozark folklore encode memory of these events, or whether they are independent mythological developments with parallels in the flood traditions of many cultures worldwide, is a question that cannot be definitively answered with current evidence. But the flood traditions of Australian Aboriginal peoples, which have been shown to encode accurate memory of sea level changes that occurred more than 10,000 years ago, provide a precedent for the long-term survival of geological memory in oral tradition that should caution against dismissing the Ozark flood stories as simply mythological. The plant knowledge encoded in Ozark folk medicine is another domain where the persistence of older understanding is visible, though often in forms that make its ultimate origin difficult to trace. Ozark folk medicine, as documented by Randolph and others, includes a substantial body of plant-based treatments for specific conditions that overlap significantly with both the indigenous materia medica of the region and with the broader Appalachian and mid-continent folk medical traditions. Some of this overlap reflects the documented historical exchange of plant knowledge between indigenous peoples and European settlers that occurred throughout the eastern United States during the contact and early settlement periods. Settlers regularly learned about the medicinal properties of native plants from indigenous neighbors, and that knowledge was integrated into the settler folk medical tradition in ways that were sometimes acknowledged and sometimes not. But some of the specific treatments and the specific plants used in Ozark folk medicine are locally distinctive in ways that suggest local origin, and some of the most effective local treatments are for conditions and with plants that do not have clear parallels in the European folk medical traditions that settlers brought with them. The possibility that some of the plant knowledge embedded in Ozark folk medicine ultimately derives from indigenous sources, transmitted through contact and exchange and maintained in the settler tradition, is consistent with what is known about the history of medical knowledge exchange in the region, and it is another dimension of the Ozarks' deep history that is preserved, however indirectly, in the living tradition of the landscape. The place names of the Ozarks also encode history in ways that reward attention. The indigenous place names, Osage and Quapaw, and other indigenous languages that were applied to rivers, mountains, and communities during the settlement period have been retained in some cases and translated or replaced in others. The names that were retained, like the name Osage itself, or the names of rivers like the Nyangwa and the Pomme de Terre, which is a French translation of an Osage name meaning potato stone or potato earth, preserve linguistic evidence of the indigenous presence in the landscape, and sometimes of the qualities of specific places that the indigenous occupants were recording in their names. The name Nyangwa, which is an Americanization of an Osage term, has been interpreted as referring to the mussel species that historically occurred in abundance in that river, species that were an important food source for the indigenous peoples of the region and that were also traded for their shell. The mussel connection is interesting because the Ozarks are still one of the most mussel-rich regions in North America, with dozens of species occurring in the clear rivers, and because mussels, particularly their shells, appear consistently in the archaeological record as both food remains and as objects of value in the long-distance exchange networks of the pre-contact period. Place names, in other words, are not just labels. They are records of observations made by people with deep knowledge of specific places. Observations about the properties of those places that were worth preserving in the landscape's name. When you look at the place names of the Ozarks with that understanding, the landscape begins to speak a language that is older than the English or French names that have been layered over it in the past 3 centuries. The hill country language documented by Randolph and others, the specific vocabulary of the Ozark Euro-American tradition, is itself a remarkable artifact. It preserves archaic English words and constructions that disappeared from standard American English generations ago. It preserves Scottish and Irish and English dialect terms that were carried to the Ozarks by the settlers who came from the upland south in the 18th and 19th centuries. And it has developed local terms for local phenomena that reflect the specific environment of the Ozark Plateau in ways that standard American English does not have vocabulary to express. The word hollow, pronounced holler in the traditional Ozark dialect, is not just a synonym for valley. It describes a specific kind of valley feature of the Ozark landscape, a narrow, steep-sided drainage that is enclosed and intimate, and that has specific ecological and acoustic properties that distinguish it from the open valleys of the river systems. To know that word, in the way that people who grew up in the Ozarks know it, is to know something specific about the landscape that cannot be fully communicated in standard geographical vocabulary. The traditional Ozark vocabulary for landscape features is one of the ways in which the deep familiarity of generations of people with a specific landscape is encoded and transmitted, and it is part of the cultural archive of the region that is relevant to its history in ways that formal academic disciplines have been slow to recognize. The stories that Ozark people tell about specific places in the landscape, stories that have been circulating in the region for as long as there has been a Euro-American community here to tell them, consistently circle around certain themes that are relevant to the question of what was in the Ozarks before the current inhabitants arrived. Stories about old things found in the ground when fields were cleared or roads were built. Stories about underground spaces encountered unexpectedly in the course of ordinary activities. Stories about specific places that have always been avoided, that the storyteller's grandparents avoided, and their grandparents before them, for reasons that have been forgotten or that were never clearly stated. Stories about objects or structures that could not be accounted for by the history that the storytellers knew. These stories are not, for the most part, sensationalized or dramatic. They are matter of fact, presented as records of things that happened to real people in real places, often with specific details about location and circumstance that suggest they are based on actual experiences rather than being invented for entertainment. The frequency with which specific locations appear in multiple independent accounts is one of the things that makes these stories worth taking seriously. When the same hollow or the same spring or the same ridgetop appears in accounts collected from different people at different times, the convergence of independent testimony on the same location suggests that something about that location produces consistently remarkable experiences, even if the interpretation of those experiences varies from account to account. The formal investigation of these locations, when it has occurred, has sometimes produced confirmation that something significant is present and sometimes produced inconclusive results. But the formal investigation has been far from systematic, and many of the locations that appear most frequently in the folklore accounts have never been formally investigated at all. The Ozark landscape has a way of preserving its own history that goes beyond what any human effort could maintain. The caves preserve materials in conditions of exceptional stability. The springs maintain flows that have continued for longer than human memory. The limestone of the bluffs records the passage of water in solution features that trace the history of the hydrological system going back millions of years. The soils of the ridgetops and valley bottoms preserve the chemical and physical signatures of the things that happened to them over centuries and millennia, and the living organisms of the region carry in their genomes the history of the landscape's stability and change over geological time. All of these archives are available to be read by those who have the tools and the knowledge to read them, and the reading of them over the past century has consistently produced a picture that is more complex, more rich, and more surprising than the standard accounts of the region would suggest. The deeper the investigation goes, the stranger it gets. Not strange in the sense of supernatural or inexplicable, but strange in the sense of being more complicated and more layered than the simple narratives that most people carry about the Ozarks. Strange in the sense that the more you know about the region, the more you realize how much is still unknown. Strange in the sense that the answers the research produces consistently generate more and better questions, rather than settling the matter and moving on. The Ozarks do not resolve into a simple story. They resist resolution, not because they are inherently mysterious, but because they are genuinely complex in ways that cannot be reduced to a simple account without losing something essential. The depth of time that the region embodies, the biological richness that reflects its refugial history, the human history that spans at least 14,000 years and possibly more, the documentary record that contains both the formally documented and the informally observed, and the living knowledge of the people who have been in the region longest and know it most deeply, all of these together constitute a picture of the Ozarks that is worth the effort of understanding. And the effort of understanding it begins with the recognition that what the textbooks say is not the whole story, that the formal record is substantially smaller than the reality it represents, and that the deeper you dig into the Ozarks, in any sense of the word dig, the stranger and richer the picture becomes. There is a specific quality to the research being done in the Ozarks right now, in the 21st century, that is different from the research of earlier periods. The tools are better. LiDAR is revealing landscape features that would have been invisible to earlier survey methods. Portable X-ray fluorescence analysis allows the chemical characterization of stone artifacts in the field, making it possible to trace raw material sources with a precision that was not achievable with earlier methods. Ancient DNA analysis is beginning to be applied to human remains from Ozark sites in ways that will produce new information about the genetic relationships between pre-contact populations in the region and between Ozark populations and populations elsewhere in North America. Isotope analysis of human and faunal remains is providing new information about diet, mobility, and trade. And the integration of oral historical sources, particularly the traditions of the Osage Nation and other indigenous groups with deep historical connections to the Ozarks, is providing contextual information that enriches the interpretation of the material record in ways that purely material analysis cannot achieve. But better tools alone do not produce better understanding if they are not combined with better questions. And the better questions about Ozark archaeology are now being asked more consistently than they have been in the past. The question of what the Ozarks contributed to the Hopewell interaction sphere, and to what extent the Ozarks can be considered a productive center rather than a peripheral resource zone in that network. The question of what the relationship between Cahokia and the Ozarks actually was during the peak Mississippian period, and whether it was more complex and more mutual than the standard peripheral model implies. The question of what caused the apparent demographic and political changes in the Ozarks during the late Mississippian period, and how those changes relate to the broader collapse of Mississippian political systems across the eastern United States. The question of what kinds of landscape modification and management were practiced in the Ozarks by pre-contact indigenous peoples, and what the evidence of those practices, visible in some cases in the LiDAR data, and in some cases in the historical accounts, and in some cases in the living landscape, tells us about the intensity and sophistication of pre-contact land use in the region. These are serious research questions that are beginning to attract serious research attention. And the results, when they come, will substantially revise the standard picture of the Ozarks' place in North American prehistory. One of the most exciting current research programs in Ozark archaeology involves the systematic application of LiDAR to the river valleys of the northern Arkansas Ozarks, an area that has been archaeologically significant since the earliest documented surveys, but that has never been comprehensively assessed. The LiDAR surveys are revealing the presence of earthen features in the valley bottoms and on the terraces above the rivers that are not on any existing site map, and that in some cases appear large enough and regular enough to represent significant architectural investments. The preliminary analysis of some of these features suggests connections to the woodland and Mississippian mound-building traditions of the broader region, but with aspects that are locally distinctive and that may represent regional variants of those traditions that have not previously been documented. The ground truthing of the LiDAR findings in the northern Arkansas Ozarks is in progress, and the results are being treated cautiously and methodically by the researchers involved. But the direction of the evidence is clear. The formal archaeological record of the northern Arkansas Ozarks is missing significant features that were present in the landscape and that are now visible in the LiDAR data. What those features represent, in terms of the activities and the peoples that created them, is a question that the next decade of research will begin to answer. The cave research is in a similarly exciting state. The systematic documentation of cave art in Missouri and Arkansas has been accelerating, driven by the development of photogrammetry and structured light scanning technologies that allow the precise three-dimensional documentation of cave wall surfaces without touching them. These technologies are being applied to sites that were previously documented only through hand tracings or photography, and in many cases the more precise documentation is revealing features that earlier methods missed. Faint engravings under more obvious painted features, spatial relationships between different elements of cave art panels that are only visible when the panel geometry is precisely captured, and connections between images at different sites that share specific iconographic elements and that imply communication between the communities that produce them. The Picture Cave project, which has been working for several years to produce a comprehensive documentation of the most complex rock art site in the Ozarks, has already produced significant new findings about the organization and iconography of the art at that site. The three-dimensional documentation has revealed that some of the images at Picture Cave are positioned to be visible only from specific positions within the cave, suggesting that the spatial experience of moving through the site was carefully considered by its creators. Some images appear to have been designed to appear and disappear as a viewer moves past them, creating an animated quality in the flickering light conditions under which they would originally have been experienced. This kind of spatial sophistication in the organization of cave art implies a level of planning and intentionality in the creation of the site that goes beyond what was previously recognized, and it raises new questions about who was creating the art, what training and knowledge they brought to the task, and what community supported their work over the centuries that the site was in use. The spring systems of the Ozarks are the subject of ongoing hydrological and biological research that continues to produce surprises. New species are still being described from Ozark cave and spring systems at a rate that suggests the total diversity of the underground fauna has not yet been characterized. New hydrological connections between surface and subsurface water systems are still being identified through dye trace studies that follow the movement of tracer dyes through the karst system. And the sensitivity of the spring systems to changes in land use in the recharge areas above them is producing evidence of the consequences of human activity in the watershed going back centuries, evidence that is relevant both to the management of the springs in the present and to the interpretation of the archaeological record in the cave systems they discharge from. The ongoing decline of some spring systems, due to groundwater extraction, agricultural runoff, and the effects of increasing drought frequency, is creating a sense of urgency in both the biological and the archaeological research communities about the importance of documenting the resources of these systems before they are further degraded. The springs of the Ozarks are at the same time among the most ancient features of the landscape, maintained by geological processes that have been operating for millions of years, and among the most vulnerable features in the face of current human land use patterns. The tension between their ancient character and their contemporary vulnerability is one of the things that makes the Ozarks a particularly interesting and particularly important place to be paying attention to right now. The people who are doing the most important current research in the Ozarks tend to share a quality that you notice when you talk to them. They have been in the landscape long enough to have developed a feel for it that goes beyond what their formal training provided. They have walked enough hollows, floated enough rivers, and spent enough time in enough caves to have internalized something about the place that they struggle to articulate in scientific language. But that shapes the questions they ask and the interpretations they reach. This is not anti-scientific. The best scientists in any field develop an intuitive understanding of their subject that guides their formal analysis in ways that purely algorithmic reasoning cannot replicate. In the Ozarks, where the landscape is both the subject of study and the context in which study takes place, the development of that intuitive understanding is particularly important and particularly difficult to communicate to people who have not spent time in the region. The difficulty of communicating what the Ozarks are, in their fullness and their depth, is one of the reasons that the standard accounts of the region are so consistently inadequate. The accounts that work, the ones that capture something real about the Ozarks, tend to be the ones written by people who have been there long enough to stop being surprised by everything and to start noticing the things that are consistently surprising, the things that remain puzzling after you have explained everything you can explain, and that point toward aspects of the place that the available frameworks do not fully account for. Those are the things worth paying attention to. Those are the things that this account has tried, across the last several hours, to point toward, even when it could not fully describe them. The Ozarks are not a mystery in the tabloid sense, not a region full of ancient secrets waiting to be sensationally revealed. They are a mystery in the more interesting sense, a place where the depth of history exceeds the capacity of the current evidence base and the current analytical frameworks to fully account for it, where the closer you look, the more you realize how much remains to be looked at, and where the standard story is consistently revealed, by sustained attention, to be a simplified version of something substantially more complex and more interesting. The rivers are still running clear over their gravel beds. The springs are still discharging from the aquifers. The caves are still preserving in their depths whatever they have preserved for the past 10,000 years. The bluffs are still standing above the valleys with the same indifference to human time that they have maintained since before the first people arrived to look up at them. And somewhere in the formal record, in the historical accounts, in the oral traditions of the peoples who have known this landscape longest, in the as yet unanalyzed LiDAR data, in the unexcavated and undated features that LiDAR is revealing, in the underwater passages of the cave systems that no diver has yet followed to their end, in all of these places and more, the full story of the Ozarks is waiting. The deeper we dig, the stranger it gets. Not because the Ozarks are hiding something, because the real history of any place is always more complicated and more layered than the summaries we make of it, and the Ozarks have more layers than most. The work of reading those layers is ongoing, and the people doing that work are finding things that were not in the standard accounts, and that will eventually change those accounts in ways we cannot entirely predict. That is what makes this a story worth following, not just because of what it has already revealed, but because of what it is in the process of revealing right now, and what it will go on revealing for as long as people are willing to do the patient, careful, open-minded work of actually finding out. There is something specific about the way the Ozarks feel at dusk in late summer, when the light goes gold and then amber, and then the shadows in the hollows deepen faster than the sky. The sound of the rivers carries farther in that light, and the bluffs take on a density that they do not have in full daylight, as if the limestone is drawing something back into itself that it released during the day. The caves breathe then, the air inside them slightly warmer than the evening air outside, exhaling through the sinkholes and the cave mouths in barely perceptible currents. The springs continue their long discharge, unchanged by the hour or the season, carrying water that fell as rain somewhere up on the plateau weeks or months or years ago and has been traveling ever since through the darkness of the aquifer, emerging finally into the light and the air and the living world above. Whatever happened in this landscape over the past 14,000 years, whatever the people who came and went and stayed and left and returned again were doing and making and thinking and believing, the landscape absorbed it all, registered it in its soils and its sediments and its cave deposits and its rock art and its stone alignments and its spring mounds, carried some of it forward into the documentary record, into the oral traditions, to the folk beliefs, into the place names, into the things that people who have lived in the Ozarks for generations know, without quite knowing how they know it. The full accounting of what happened here will not be produced in this generation or the next. It is work that will take decades, and that will require the collaboration of archaeologists and biologists and geologists and historians and indigenous scholars and the people who have been living in and with this landscape long enough to have learned some of what it has to teach. But the work is underway, and it is producing results that are changing the picture. If you are still listening, you have now heard a version of the Ozarks story that is substantially different from the version most people carry. It is a version that takes seriously the 14,000 years of human presence before European contact, and the geological and biological depth that preceded that. It is a version that acknowledges what the formal record does not yet contain, rather than pretending the gaps do not exist. And it is a version that points toward the research frontier, toward the questions that are being asked and the work that is being done to answer them, rather than pretending that the story has already been told. The Ozarks have not been fully told, they may never be, but the telling is worth doing, and the listening is worth doing, and the quiet work of paying attention to a landscape that has been paying attention in its own geological and biological and archaeological ways for longer than human beings have been here to notice it. That is work that makes the world more interesting rather than less. The hollows are still full of their particular darkness, the springs are still running, the caves are still deep, and the gravel bars are still giving up, from time to time, the things that the rivers have been carrying for a very long time. If this slow walk through the deep Ozarks kept your mind moving in interesting directions while the rest of the world went quiet, you can let the algorithm know you found it worthwhile by tapping the like button. Subscribe if you want to keep following these long, careful digs into the history that the standard accounts tend to skip over. Leave a comment if you want to, whether that is your location and time zone, or a question about something you heard tonight that you want to know more about, or just a note that you made it through to the end. The channel membership is there for those who want to support this kind of work at a more sustained level, and every member makes it possible to spend more time doing the research, rather than worrying about whether the next video will happen. But watching and listening and thinking alongside these stories is already the most important thing. The Ozarks will still be there in the morning, as they have been every morning for 300 million years. Sleep well, and when you wake up, the springs will still be running. The western margins of the Ozarks, where the plateau drops away toward the Arkansas River Valley in the south and the Kansas and Oklahoma plains to the west, represent a zone of transition that has been archaeologically understudied relative to the central and northern parts of the region. This is partly a function of research history and partly a function of the different land use patterns in the western Ozarks, where agriculture was more productive than in the rockier central plateau, and where the archaeological record has accordingly been more disturbed by farming and development. But the western Ozark margin is archaeologically significant in ways that the standard accounts underrepresent, and recent work in the area has been producing results that require the standard account to be substantially revised. The Spiro Mound site in eastern Oklahoma, located at the far western edge of the Ozark Cultural Zone, is one of the most important and most controversial archaeological sites in North America. Spiro was a major Mississippian ceremonial center that functioned from roughly 900 to 1400 CE, and it was the westernmost significant mound center in the Mississippian world. Its location at the western edge of the Ozarks, controlling access to both the Arkansas River Valley and the trade routes leading west toward the plains, made it a critical node in the exchange networks that connected the Mississippian world to the cultures of the Great Plains and the Southwest. What Spiro accumulated during its 4 or 5 centuries of operation as a ceremonial center was extraordinary. The Great Mortuary, a specialized burial facility at the site, contained one of the largest and most extraordinary collections of Mississippian ceremonial artifacts ever found. Copper repoussé plates of extraordinary artistic sophistication, marine shell gorgets and cups with engraved imagery of the highest quality, wooden sculptures and textiles preserved by the copper salts that surrounded them, hundreds of pottery vessels, stone pallets, and other objects representing the full range of Mississippian material culture at its most elaborate. The iconographic program at Spiro, the system of symbols and figures and narratives that appears across the ceremonial artifacts from the site, has been studied intensively and has provided some of the primary evidence for the reconstruction of what archaeologists call the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, the network of shared symbols and beliefs that connected Mississippian communities across much of the eastern United States. Spiro was not a passive recipient of this material. The evidence suggests that it was an active producer of ceremonial goods and a center of ritual knowledge that attracted pilgrims and participants from a wide surrounding region. The physical investment at Spiro, the labor required to build and maintain the mound complex and the great mortuary, was substantial by any standard, and it implies a community with the political organization and the resource base to support sustained ritual activity at a significant scale. The connection between Spiro and the broader Ozark region is established through the material culture. Ozark cherts appear in artifacts from Spiro. Ozark galena is present at the site. The exchange networks that supplied Spiro with the raw materials for its ceremonial production passed through the Ozarks, and the communities of the Ozark interior were connected to Spiro either directly or through intermediate exchange partners. The specific nature of the Ozark-Spiro relationship is not well documented archaeologically, partly because the western Ozark sites, that would have been the most direct intermediaries, have been less thoroughly investigated than sites farther east, and partly because the looting of Spiro in the 1930s, before it was formally excavated, destroyed much of the contextual information that would have allowed more precise reconstruction of its exchange relationships. The Spiro looting is itself a story worth telling in the Ozark context, because it represents one of the most destructive episodes of commercial artifact collecting in North American archaeological history, and because its consequences for the understanding of the Ozark-Spiro connection have been severe. Commercial diggers, operating under a lease issued by the landowner, tunneled into the great mortuary at Spiro, beginning in 1933, and over the following 2 years, removed and sold an estimated 200,000 individual artifacts, scattering them to private collections and dealers across the country. The contextual information that would have allowed archaeologists to understand the organization of the Great Mortuary, the spatial relationships between different categories of objects, the stratigraphic sequence that would have allowed dating of different deposits, was destroyed in the course of this looting and cannot be recovered. Oklahoma passed a law prohibiting the excavation of archaeological sites without a permit, partly as a result of the Spiro scandal, making it one of the first states to enact such legislation. But the damage was done, and the information lost at Spiro in those 2 years has permanently limited the understanding of the Western Mississippian and its connections to the Ozark region. What has been recovered through systematic research since the establishment of the Spiro Mounds Archaeological State Park in 1938 is substantial, but inevitably incomplete. The iconography of the Spiro artifacts, preserved in museum collections across the country, has been the primary data source for the study of the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex and its connections across the Mississippian world. The analysis of that iconography has revealed connections to Cahokia, to the major sites of the lower Mississippi Valley, and to the traditions of the broader eastern United States that demonstrate the degree to which Spiro was embedded in a continental-scale cultural and exchange system. And that system passed through the Ozarks. The question of how the Ozark communities participated in that system and what they produced and exchanged and received is one that continued research in the western Ozarks and in the Ozark-Arkansas River transition zone is beginning to address more systematically. The work of the Arkansas Archaeological Survey in the river valleys of northwestern Arkansas has been particularly productive in recent years, documenting sites and assemblages in the transition zone between the Ozark uplands and the Arkansas River Valley that show the complexity of the Mississippian occupation in that region and its connections to both the Ozark interior and the major Mississippian centers to the south and east. The sites being documented by this work are not on the scale of Cahokia or Spiro, but they are larger and more complex than the standard peripheral model would predict. and they are producing evidence of exchange and ceremonial activity that implies connections to a broader Mississippian world that extended well beyond the immediate region. The Caddo peoples, who were the dominant indigenous group in the Arkansas River Valley and surrounding areas at the time of European contact, have oral traditions and historical connections to the Ozark region that have not been fully explored in the archaeological literature. The Caddo Confederacy, which was one of the most politically and culturally complex indigenous societies in the Southern Plains and Ozark margin at the time of contact, had deep roots in the archaeological cultures of the region going back centuries before European arrival. The relationship between the Caddo and the Mississippian traditions of the Ozark region is complex and debated, but the material culture connections between the two traditions are clear, and the geographic area in which those connections are strongest is precisely the western Ozark margin and the Arkansas River Valley. The history of the Caddo in this region, including their early contact with Spanish explorers and their subsequent interactions with French traders and English colonial powers, is a story that is relevant to the broader question of what the Western Ozarks were before and during European contact. It is also a story that is too rarely told in the context of Ozark history, which tends to treat the region's indigenous history as ending with the Osage, and to ignore the southern and western indigenous connections that are clearly present in the archaeological and historical record. The Quapaw, who were in the lower Arkansas River Valley at the time of sustained French contact, have connections to the Ozark region through their oral traditions and through the material culture of their ancestors that have also been underexplored. The Quapaw oral tradition includes accounts of movements and relationships that connect them to the broader Mississippian world and to specific places in the Arkansas River Valley and adjacent Ozark foothills that have archaeological significance. The integration of Quapaw oral tradition with the archaeological record of the lower Arkansas Valley is a project that tribal scholars and archaeologists are beginning to work on collaboratively, with results that are expected to significantly enrich the understanding of both the late pre-contact and early historic periods in the region. What all of this work in the western and southern Ozarks is converging on is a picture of the region as a zone of active cultural interaction and exchange, a place where the Mississippian traditions of the central river valleys met the Caddoan traditions of the southern plains margin and the Osage and other central Siouan traditions of the central plateau in ways that produced a complex and dynamic cultural landscape. That landscape is not well captured by the simple peripheral model that has dominated Ozark archaeological interpretation for most of the 20th century, and the research of the past 2 decades has been steadily building the evidence base for a different and more complex interpretation. The revision of the standard account is not yet complete. There are still large gaps in the evidence, still major questions that cannot be answered with the current data, still interpretive disputes among researchers that will not be resolved quickly. But the direction of the revision is clear, and it is in the direction of greater complexity, greater connectivity, and greater cultural richness than the standard account has acknowledged. The Ozarks, seen from the western margin, are not a peripheral region. They are a convergence zone, a place where multiple major cultural traditions met and interacted over long periods of time, producing a regional cultural landscape that is both distinctive and deeply connected to the broader North American pre-contact world. Understanding the Ozarks in that context, as a convergence zone rather than a backwater, changes both the questions that are worth asking and the interpretation of the evidence that is available to answer them. And the evidence available in the Western Ozarks, once that reframing is applied, is considerably richer than the standard accounts have acknowledged. The caves of the Western Ozarks, which have received less formal attention than the caves of the central and northern plateau, contain rock art and archaeological deposits that are beginning to be documented more systematically. The springs of the Ouachita Mountain Transition Zone, which share many of the hydrological characteristics of the Ozark Springs, but have a somewhat different geological setting, have evidence of long indigenous use that connects them to the broader pattern of spring-centered ritual activity documented across the region. And the landscape itself, in the transition zone between the Ozarks and the surrounding lowlands and plains, has a quality of openness and long visibility that would have made it particularly valuable for groups monitoring movement across the landscape, a quality that may be reflected in the location of some of the archaeological sites in the zone that have been found in commanding positions overlooking the major routes of movement through the region. The Ouachita Mountains, which border the Ozarks to the south and which are separated from the Ozark Plateau by the Arkansas River Valley, are geologically distinct from the Ozarks, but archaeologically connected to them in ways that require a brief consideration in the context of this account. The Ouachitas are east-west trending ridges formed by the folding and faulting of Paleozoic sedimentary rocks during the same tectonic events that produced the Ozark Plateau, but they have been compressed and deformed to a much greater degree than the Ozarks, and they present a different topographic and ecological character. The Ouachitas are higher and more rugged than the Ozarks, with ridge crests reaching 3,000 feet or more, and they support a different mix of vegetation reflecting both the higher elevation and the different exposure. They also contain different mineral resources, including high-quality novaculite, a dense, fine-grained siliceous rock that is an excellent flint-knapping material. Ouachita novaculite appears in archaeological sites across the eastern United States in quantities that demonstrate it was an important trade material in the pre-contact period, and the quarry sites where it was extracted are among the longest continuously used resource locations in the entire region. The relationship between the Ouachita Mountains and the Ozarks in the archaeological record is one of complementary resource zones connected by the trade networks of the Arkansas River Valley. What each region produced that the other needed created the basis for sustained exchange, and the people of the Arkansas River Valley, whether Caddoan or pre-Caddoan in cultural affiliation, were the natural intermediaries in that exchange. The picture that emerges from integrating the Ozark and Ouachita archaeological records, mediated by the Arkansas River Valley, is one of a regional system of complementary resource extraction and exchange that operated for millennia and that connected communities across a substantial geographic area in organized and sustained ways. This picture is larger and more organized than the standard accounts suggest, and it implies a level of regional economic and political coordination in the pre-contact Ozark-Arkansas-Ouachita zone that the standard peripheral model of the Ozarks does not accommodate. The archaeology of any region is shaped by the questions researchers bring to it. The questions change, the methods improve, and the picture changes with them. In the Ozarks, the questions that dominated the early 20th century were primarily descriptive. What types of artifacts occur here? In what quantities? And in what spatial distributions? The answers to those questions produced the basic culture-historical framework that is still the foundation of Ozark archaeology, the sequence of periods and cultures that allows researchers to place individual sites and assemblages in a temporal and cultural context. But the descriptive framework, however necessary, is not sufficient to answer the questions that are now most pressing. It can tell you what kinds of things were made and used in the Ozarks at different times, but it cannot tell you how the communities that made and used those things were organized, what they were thinking, what relationships they maintained with their neighbors and with the landscape, or how they understood themselves and their place in the world. Answering those more difficult questions requires a different approach to the evidence, one that takes the material record as a starting point rather than an end point, and that integrates it with the full range of other sources of information available, including the oral traditions of the indigenous peoples with connections to the region, the historical documentary record, the ecological and geological record, and the landscape evidence of past human activity. This more integrative approach is what the best current research in Ozark archaeology is attempting, and the results are substantially richer than what the purely descriptive approach was producing. One of the specific areas where the integrative approach is producing new understanding is the study of Ozark site catchments and land use patterns. A site catchment is the area from which a community drew its food, raw materials, and other resources. Analysis of site catchments tells you something about the economic organization of a community and its relationship to the surrounding landscape. In the Ozarks, site catchment analysis has shown that even relatively small communities in the woodland and Mississippian periods had access to a diverse range of resources drawn from different ecological zones within the highly variable Ozark landscape. The vertical zonation of the Ozark landscape, from the rocky ridge crests through the mixed woodlands of the slopes to the fertile bottomlands of the river valleys, creates a concentration of different resource types within small geographic distances that would have been highly advantageous for communities with the mobility and the knowledge to exploit them. A community located at the mouth of a tributary hollow, with the river bottomland in front of it and the limestone uplands behind, had access to the full range of Ozark ecological diversity within a few miles in any direction. The diversity of the resource base available in such a location, combined with the stability of the spring water that kept the river running even in dry seasons, would have made it an extremely attractive location for long-term settlement. And the archaeological record consistently shows that such locations were, in fact, occupied repeatedly over long periods, with evidence of use at different periods stratified in the valley deposits. The specific pattern of site clustering that characterizes the Ozark archaeological record, with sites concentrated at the mouths of tributary hollows and at spring locations and thinning out across the ridge tops and in the most remote interior hollows, reflects the economic logic of Ozark landscape use. Communities were situated to maximize access to the diversity of the Ozark resource base, and the specific locations they chose, the ones that appear most frequently in the formal site record, are the ones that provided the best combination of water, arable land, wild food resources, and defensibility. The stability of that settlement logic across thousands of years, from the Dalton period through the Contact period, tells you something important about the Ozark landscape. It is a place where the same ecological logic produces the same site location decisions across a very long span of time, because the features of the landscape that make those locations optimal have not changed. The spring at the mouth of the hollow that attracted Dalton people 10,000 years ago attracted woodland people 5,000 years ago, and Mississippian people 1,000 years ago, and Euro-American settlers 300 years ago. The springs are still there, and people are still living near them, and the continuity of that association is one of the most striking features of the Ozark landscape record when you step back far enough to see the full temporal scope. The political organization of pre-contact Ozark communities is one of the most difficult aspects of the region's prehistory to recover from the material record, and it is also one of the most important for understanding what the Ozarks were and how they functioned in the broader North American context. The absence of very large-scale mound complexes in the Ozark interior has often been interpreted as evidence that the region lacked the political complexity required to organize that kind of labor investment. But this interpretation conflates political complexity with a specific expression of that complexity, monumental mound construction, that may not have been the form that Ozark political organization took. Different political systems express their complexity in different ways, and the specific form of expression depends on the combination of environmental constraints, available resources, cultural traditions, and political choices that characterize a particular community or region. In the Ozarks, where labor for large-scale construction was probably limited by the small community sizes required by the resource base of the uplands, the expression of political complexity may have taken forms other than monumental architecture, control of exchange networks, specialization in the production of specific high-value goods, the maintenance of ritual knowledge and the performance of ritual services for surrounding communities, the management of specific critical resources like salt and galena. All of these could have been expressions of political power and organizational capacity in the Ozark context that leave a different material signature than mound construction, but that represent no less real to a political complexity. The salt spring sites of the central Missouri Ozarks provide a possible example of this kind of resource-based political power. Sites with exclusive or preferred access to major salt spring deposits would have had leverage in exchange negotiations with communities that needed salt and could not obtain it elsewhere. The scale of salt production at major Ozark sites, which as noted earlier appears to have exceeded local needs, implies that the communities controlling those sites were producing salt not just for themselves but for distribution to others. Who controlled that distribution, and on what terms, is not recoverable from the material record alone, but the fact of the production at that scale implies an organizational capacity that goes beyond simple subsistence-level activity. The copper working tradition of the Old Copper Complex, which as noted has significant representation in the Ozark region during the Archaic period, also implies organizational capacity of a specific kind. The acquisition, transport, and working of copper requires specialized knowledge and tools, access to the copper sources, or to exchange networks that provided copper, and the organizational capacity to direct labor toward the production of objects that were primarily of ceremonial or status value, rather than of immediate subsistence utility. Communities investing significant energy in copper working are communities that have surplus energy beyond subsistence requirements, and that are directing that surplus toward the production of social currency, objects that mark status, cement relationships, and create obligations. The presence of old copper complex material in the Ozarks, whether locally produced or obtained through trade, is evidence of participation in a social system that was sophisticated enough to produce and value that kind of material culture. The Archaic period in the Ozarks, which spans roughly from 10,000 to 3,000 years ago, and which brackets the old copper complex at its later end, is the least thoroughly understood major period in the region's archaeology. The Archaic is defined archaeologically primarily by its stone tool assemblages, which show a progression from the large bifacial tools of the early Archaic through the smaller and more diverse assemblages of the Middle and Late Archaic. The subsistence strategies of archaic peoples in the Ozarks are documented primarily through the remains of plant and animal foods found in the rock shelter sites, which show a broad-spectrum foraging economy that exploited the full range of the Ozark landscape's resources. The social organization of archaic communities is much harder to recover, because the Archaic period predates the development of the earthen mound tradition and the elaborate ceremonial material culture that provide the primary evidence of social complexity in later periods. What evidence there is suggests that archaic communities in the Ozarks were not simple and egalitarian in the way that early anthropological models of hunter-gatherer societies assumed. The evidence of long-distance exchange in archaic period sites, the organizational capacity implied by the exploitation of specific resource locations over long periods, and the accumulation of the ecological knowledge that the bluff dweller sites demonstrate was available to late archaic communities, all suggest a level of social sophistication that the simple forager model does not capture. The late Archaic in particular, with the development of the Eastern agricultural complex, the cultivation of native seed plants, including goosefoot, marsh elder, and sunflower, shows the beginning of the intensification of food production that would eventually, via the adoption of maize agriculture in the woodland period, produce the larger and more sedentary communities of the Mississippian period. This agricultural intensification was not a sudden revolution. It was a gradual process that took centuries, during which communities in the Ozarks and throughout the eastern United States were experimenting with different strategies for increasing the reliability and productivity of their food supply. The rock shelter sites of the Ozarks contain evidence of this transition in their stratigraphic sequences, with the relative abundance of different plant species changing through time in ways that reflect both the changing availability of resources in the landscape and the changing decisions of communities about what to grow and what to collect. The transition from the late Archaic to the woodland period in the Ozarks, which occurs roughly 3,000 years ago, is marked in the archaeological record by the appearance of pottery, the development of mound burial traditions, and the intensification of exchange in the Hopewell system. These changes were not the result of population replacement. The genetic evidence from the few sites where ancient DNA has been analyzed suggests continuity of population through this transition, with the new cultural practices being adopted by existing communities rather than introduced by incoming groups. The pottery, the mound building, and the Hopewell connections were innovations adopted by the descendants of the archaic peoples of the Ozarks, additions to an existing cultural tradition rather than replacements for it. This picture of cultural continuity with innovation is consistent with what archaeologists have found in most parts of the eastern United States, where the transition from the archaic to the woodland period appears to represent a transformation of existing societies rather than their replacement. The Ozarks fit this broader pattern, and the specific form of the woodland transformation in the Ozarks, which as noted earlier has locally distinctive features in both the mortuary tradition and the ceremonial site record, is part of the evidence for the development of regional cultural identity within the broader woodland and later Mississippian traditions. That regional identity was real and persistent. It expressed itself in specific ways of making pottery, in specific configurations of stone mortuary features, in specific patterns of land use and resource exploitation, and in the specific ritual tradition documented in the cave art of the region. It was not isolation. The Ozarks were connected through the Hopewell interaction sphere and later through the Mississippian Exchange Network to the broader cultural world of pre-contact North America. But the way the Ozarks participated in that broader world was shaped by the specific character of the Ozark environment and by the specific trajectory of the cultural tradition that developed in response to that environment over thousands of years. The distinctiveness of the Ozark tradition within the broader Eastern North American archaeological record is itself a kind of evidence about the depth and persistence of the human presence in the region. Traditions do not become distinctive over short periods. They become distinctive through sustained engagement with a specific place over many generations, through the accumulation of specific knowledge, specific practices, and specific relationships with the landscape that gradually differentiate a community from its neighbors, even as it maintains connections with those neighbors through exchange and interaction. The distinctiveness of the Ozark archaeological tradition is evidence that the people of the Ozarks were there long enough and engaged deeply enough with the place to develop a cultural character that sets them apart from the archaeological traditions of the surrounding regions, while remaining clearly connected to the broader world of pre-contact North America. That is what you would expect to find in a region that people have been living in and with for at least 14,000 years, and it is what the Ozark archaeological record shows. The underground rivers of the Ozarks are one of the least known aspects of the region to people who have not spent time studying its hydrology. There are rivers running in the dark beneath the Ozark Plateau that no one has ever. Rivers that drain entire watersheds of the upland surface through cave passages that were carved by water moving over thousands and tens of thousands of years through the limestone. These are not just seeps or drips or the small flows that characterize most cave systems. Some of the underground rivers of the Ozarks carry flows measured in millions of gallons per day through passages large enough to float a canoe if you could get a canoe into them, which in many cases you cannot. They discharge at the major springs, but between their points of capture in the upland sinkholes and losing streams and their points of discharge at the springs, they travel routes that in many cases have not been mapped. Cave divers have been pushing into the underwater passages that connect the springs to their recharge areas in the Missouri and Arkansas Ozarks for decades, and the maps they have produced are remarkable documents. In some spring systems, the mapped cave passage extends for miles back into the aquifer, with multiple tributary passages branching off the main conduit in patterns that reflect the structure of the fracture system in the limestone. In others, the passage quickly becomes too narrow for a diver to follow, even with the most specialized cave diving equipment, and the system beyond that point is known only through inference from the spring's hydrological behavior. The exploration of Ozark underwater caves, what cave divers call cave diving, and what they frankly acknowledge to be among the most dangerous forms of exploration practiced anywhere in the world, has produced discoveries that are genuinely remarkable. Passages decorated with speleothems, the stalactites and stalagmites and flowstone formations that build up in caves over long periods, that are now flooded, but that were dry when the speleothems formed, telling you that the cave was once at a different water level. Fossil remains of Pleistocene fauna in locations deep within cave systems, preserved by the cave environment through the entire post-Pleistocene period, and now accessible only to divers. And in a few cases, In the dry side passages above the water level in spring cave systems, evidence of human presence, ceramic sherds, stone tools, charcoal deposits, and in at least one documented case, what appears to be the remnants of a torch made from a bundle of plant material left behind at the edge of darkness by someone who came this far and no farther. The human use of the flooded or seasonally flooded portions of Ozark cave systems is poorly understood, partly because the evidence of that use has been largely inaccessible to conventional archaeology. When cave passages flood seasonally, the sediments deposited during the flooding can bury earlier materials and make them inaccessible to surface-based investigation. When passages are permanently flooded, as is the case in many Ozark spring caves, the archaeological materials in those passages are accessible only to divers who are not typically trained in archaeological recovery methods and whose primary concern is their own survival in an extremely dangerous environment. The intersection of cave diving and archaeology is a specialized field that is beginning to develop in the Ozarks, driven by the recognition that the underwater portions of Ozark cave systems likely contain archaeological materials that provide a window into aspects of pre-contact Ozark life that surface sites cannot reveal. The work of recovering and interpreting those materials is technically challenging and logistically complex, but the potential rewards in terms of new understanding are substantial. The dry upper chambers of some major Ozark spring caves, accessible via ropes and narrow passages above the spring pool, have already produced evidence of human use that extends the known history of those sites back considerably. At one Missouri spring cave system that has been partially explored by archaeologists over the past decade, a dry chamber above the main spring pool contains ceramic sherds that have been dated to the late woodland period, roughly 1,200 years ago. The sherds are associated with charcoal from a small fire, suggesting that people were sitting in that chamber by firelight, which in a cave far enough from the entrance to be in complete darkness, implies deliberate and purposeful activity rather than casual shelter use. Similar evidence from other Ozark spring cave sites suggests that the practice of entering spring caves for ritual or other purposes extended back well into the pre-contact period and was not a phenomenon limited to the dramatic, deep cave paintings of the major documented cave art sites. The springs and their associated cave systems were not just physical resources. They were places where the boundary between the surface world and the underground world was permeable, where water emerged from the darkness into the light, where the earth itself seemed to breathe. In the cosmological frameworks documented for indigenous peoples of the region, this permeability was significant. The underground world was a distinct realm with its own inhabitants and its own rules, and the places where that realm communicated with the surface world through springs and cave mouths were places of particular power and particular attention. The archaeological evidence of human activity in and around those places, extending back over thousands of years, is consistent with the cosmological significance that the documentary and oral tradition record assigns to them. The intersection of the hydrological, the archaeological, and the cosmological at the major Ozark spring sites is one of the most striking features of the region, and one of the most difficult to fully articulate without slipping into either the purely technical or the purely mystical. What the evidence actually shows is a place where the physical properties of the landscape created a pattern of resources and experiences that human beings found consistently compelling over a very long period of time, and where the response to that compellingness took forms that were both practical and symbolic, both material and meaningful. That is what human engagement with landscapes typically looks like when it is sustained over long periods, and the Ozarks show it in a particularly clear and well-documented form. The iron springs of the Ozarks, springs whose water contains elevated concentrations of dissolved iron oxides and produces the characteristic red-orange staining of the surrounding rocks, were among the most widely documented by early European travelers and the most consistently associated with ritual or medicinal significance in both indigenous and later folk tradition. The iron content of these springs was recognized by indigenous peoples as having medicinal properties and the specific springs that produced the most strongly mineralized water were the ones most consistently associated with healing traditions in the documentary and oral record. The same springs drew 19th century health tourists to resorts at sites like Eureka Springs, where the concentration of mineral springs made the town a therapeutic destination in the Victorian spa tradition. The therapeutic reputation of these springs was not invented in the 19th century. It was the continuation of a recognition of the springs' properties that went back much further. The specific chemistry of the iron springs, their pH, their mineral content, and the biological communities they supported, including specific algae and iron-oxidizing bacteria that produce the characteristic colors of the spring deposits, has been studied by hydrologists and biologists without producing a full account of either the therapeutic or the cultural significance of these systems. What is clear is that the iron springs of the Ozarks were, and continue to be, places of unusual character that have consistently attracted attention and that have accumulated, over long periods, a depth of association with specific cultural practices and beliefs that makes them more than just water sources. The way in which the physical properties of specific places in the Ozarks translate into cultural significance is a recurring theme in the archaeology and history of the region, and it is one of the most interesting aspects of the Ozark story because it's ultimately about the relationship between a landscape and the human beings who have lived in it, a relationship that is both material and meaningful, and that cannot be fully understood from either the material or the meaningful side alone. The landscape produces specific experiences. Those experiences produce specific responses. Those responses accumulate over generations into cultural practices, traditions, and eventually into the formal archaeological record that researchers interpret centuries and millennia later. The chain from landscape properties to cultural practices to archaeological record is the chain that Ozark archaeology is trying to reconstruct. And the reconstruction is most successful when all of its links are attended to, when the geology and the ecology and the archaeology and the oral tradition and the documentary history are all brought to bear on the question of what happened here and why. The geomorphology of the Ozark River valleys, the specific way in which the rivers have cut into the plateau over millions of years, has produced a landscape of extraordinary visual character that has been consistently remarked on by travelers since the earliest European contact period. The bluff faces, which expose cross-sections of the limestone stratigraphy in walls that can be hundreds of feet high, are geological documents that record the history of the plateau's formation in the sequence of rock layers visible from the river. The specific optical quality of the Ozark rivers, their unusual clarity, and the way in which that clarity interacts with the overhanging bluffs and the streamside vegetation, has been described by nearly every significant traveler to the region from the early 19th century onward, in terms that convey something beyond the purely descriptive. The Current River, the Buffalo River, the 11-Point River, these are rivers that produce in observers a response that goes beyond appreciation of physical beauty, a response that seems to be about the depth of time that the landscape embodies, and the sense of encountering something that has been this way for far longer than human memory reaches. That response is not irrational. It is a perception of something real about the landscape, a perception of its geological age and ecological continuity, registered by human sensory and cognitive systems that are, in some respects, calibrated for exactly this kind of perception. Human beings spent most of their evolutionary history in close contact with landscapes that they needed to read carefully for survival, and the perceptual apparatus that evolved for that reading remains active, even when its survival relevance has been diminished by the insulation of modern life from direct landscape encounter. The response that people have to the Ozark rivers, the response that has been documented by travelers and residents and researchers across 2 centuries of written record, and that presumably existed in some form across the much longer period of indigenous occupation, is a response to real features of a real landscape, filtered through a perceptual system that was built for exactly this kind of encounter. Understanding the Ozarks fully requires taking that response seriously, not as evidence of the supernatural or the mystical, but as evidence of the reality of the landscape and of the human capacity to perceive and respond to that reality in ways that go beyond what can be fully captured in technical description. The Ozarks are not just an archaeological site or a biological reserve or a geological curiosity. They are a place where the deep history of both the Earth and the human engagement with the Earth is preserved with unusual clarity and unusual depth, and where the work of understanding that history continues to produce results that revise and enrich the standard accounts in ways that are worth attending to. The seasonal flooding of the Ozark River valleys, which historically produced dramatic and unpredictable inundations in the spring and during heavy rainfall events, is another aspect of the landscape that shaped both the human occupation patterns of the region and the distribution of the archaeological record. Communities that settled in the river valleys had to accommodate the periodic flooding that the karst hydrology produces, flooding that can be sudden and severe when the cave systems that normally absorb rainfall in the uplands reach their capacity and the water begins to move across the surface. The location of pre-contact sites in the river valleys of the Ozarks shows a consistent pattern of avoidance of the lowest floodplain areas, with occupation concentrated on the higher terraces above the maximum flood stage and on the slopes above the terraces. This is not surprising in itself, but the pattern reveals something about the knowledge that pre-contact communities had of their landscape, a knowledge of the flood dynamics of specific rivers that would have required generations of observation to develop. Communities that located their settlements at the right elevation above the floodplain, not too high to lose access to the fertile bottomland soils, but high enough to be above the maximum flood stage, had to know what the maximum flood stage was. That knowledge could only have been gained through observation over many years, accumulated and transmitted as part of the landscape knowledge that was essential to safe and productive occupation of the river valleys. The archaeological evidence for this pattern of flood-aware site location goes back at least to the woodland period, and probably considerably earlier. The terraces above the Ozark rivers contain the densest and most vertically complex archaeological deposits in the region, reflecting both the attractiveness of these locations for settlement and their long history of continuous use. The terraces were above the flood but close to the river, with access to the fertile bottomland for agriculture and to the river itself for fish, mussels, and water. They were typically sheltered from the worst winter winds by the valley walls above them and oriented to receive winter sunlight. They had defensible positions relative to the bluffs behind them. They were, in other words, optimal locations for settlement in the Ozark landscape, as defined by the combination of factors that pre-contact communities needed to consider, and the archaeological record reflects that optimality in the density and depth of occupation deposits at these locations. The flood terraces of the Ozark rivers are, in this sense, the primary archive of the human history of the region, the places where the longest and most complex records of occupation are preserved, and the places where systematic archaeological investigation has produced and will continue to produce the most comprehensive understanding of pre-contact Ozark life. The work of reading that archive, site by site, terrace by terrace, deposit by deposit, is the long-term project of Ozark archaeology, and it is a project that is nowhere near completion. The formal site record for the major Ozark River systems includes several hundred documented sites, of which only a small fraction have been subject to formal excavation. The undocumented sites, those that exist in the landscape but have not been formally recorded in the state site files, probably number in the thousands. The fully excavated sites, those for which the full stratigraphic sequence has been recovered and analyzed, number in the dozens. The gap between what exists and what has been documented and understood is enormous, and it is a gap that will take generations to close, if it can be closed at all given the ongoing destruction of sites by development, erosion, and agricultural activity. The urgency of documenting the Ozark archaeological record before more of it is destroyed is a consistent theme in the professional literature, and it is a theme that is not generating the level of public attention and institutional support that the scale of the problem requires. The Ozarks are not the American Southwest, with its dramatic cliff dwellings and painted pottery and public recognition of its archaeological significance. They are a quieter, less visually spectacular region whose pre-contact history is encoded in sites that require interpretation to make their significance legible. making that significance legible to the broader public, communicating the richness and complexity of the Ozark archaeological record in terms that are accessible and compelling without being sensationalized, is a task that the archaeological community has not always performed well. The result is a gap between the actual significance of the Ozark archaeological record and the public understanding of that significance, a gap that has consequences for the level of support available for the research and the protection of sites. Closing that gap, making the Ozarks' deep history as known and as valued as it deserves to be, is part of what makes the work of understanding and communicating that history important. The archaeology of the Ozarks has a public face that most people who visit the region never see. The Ozark National Scenic Riverways, the Buffalo National River, the Mark Twain National Forest, and the state parks of Missouri and Arkansas all sit on land that contains significant archaeological resources. The rangers and managers of these areas know that the land they manage is archaeologically important. They see the sites that erode out of stream banks every spring. They receive reports from visitors who find things in the forest that they do not recognize. They are aware of the gap between the formal site record and the archaeological reality of the landscape they are responsible for. But the resources available for systematic survey and excavation on public lands in the Ozarks have never been sufficient to close that gap at the rate at which new sites are being discovered and existing sites are being damaged. Federal agencies with land management responsibilities in the Ozarks, including the National Park Service, the Forest Service, and the Army Corps of Engineers, all have legal obligations under Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act to consider the effects of their undertakings on archaeological and historic properties. This legal framework has produced a body of archaeological survey, work on public lands in the Ozarks, that is substantial in volume and variable in quality, work that has significantly expanded the formal site record, but that has also been driven by project-specific requirements rather than by systematic research priorities. The result is a formal record that is comprehensive in some areas, particularly those that have been subject to development pressure, and very thin in others, particularly the most remote and least disturbed portions of the public land holdings. The development of collaborative research programs between the federal land management agencies, the state historic preservation offices of Missouri and Arkansas, tribal historic preservation offices of the Osage Nation and other tribes with cultural connections to the region, and academic researchers has been a gradual process that is producing more systematic and more rigorous approaches to the archaeology of the Ozarks than the project-driven compliance work of earlier decades. Programs like the Arkansas Archaeological Survey, which maintains a presence at state universities across Arkansas and conducts systematic research in addition to its compliance support functions, represent a model for the kind of sustained institutional engagement with regional archaeology that produces the most reliable and most comprehensive understanding of the archaeological record. Similar programs in Missouri, though organized somewhat differently, have produced substantial contributions to the understanding of Ozark prehistory over the past several decades. The collaboration between academic researchers and tribal historic preservation offices has been particularly productive in generating new interpretations of the archaeological record. When Osage tribal historians bring their knowledge of Osage oral tradition to the interpretation of late pre-contact and early historic sites in the Ozarks, the result is often a reading of the material that is more specific and more contextually accurate than what purely material analysis would produce. The oral traditions do not always map precisely onto the archaeological record, and there are cases where the two sources of information seem to be in tension rather than in alignment. But even those tensions are informative, because they prompt researchers to ask more carefully what each source of information is actually able to tell you, and what the limits of each source are, and what kinds of questions can be addressed by one but not the other. The methodological development that comes from this kind of interdisciplinary collaboration is one of the most important long-term contributions of the tribal academic research partnerships that have been developing in the Ozarks and elsewhere in North America over the past 2 decades. The present moment in Ozark archaeology is one of transition, from a primarily descriptive and culture-historical approach to a more interpretive and theoretically engaged approach that takes seriously the full range of evidence available, including the oral historical record and the living knowledge of the communities with the deepest historical connections to the region. This transition is producing growing pains, as any major shift in a research tradition does, and it is producing debates about methodology, interpretation, and the proper roles of different kinds of evidence that are not yet resolved. But the direction of the transition is toward a richer and more accurate understanding of the Ozarks' pre-contact history, and the work being done at the frontier of that transition is some of the most interesting archaeological research currently underway in the United States. The physical geography of the Ozarks continues to shape the experience of doing archaeology there in ways that distinguish it from work in most other regions. The terrain is difficult, the summers are hot and humid, the ticks and chiggers are persistent, the poison ivy is abundant, the rivers can rise with alarming speed when it rains. But the landscape is also extraordinarily beautiful in ways that many researchers describe as a sustaining feature of the work, something that keeps you going through the difficult days in the field. The afternoon light in a deep Buffalo River hollow, the sound of a spring discharging in the silence of a cave, the view from a limestone bluff over the river valley below, these are experiences that the physical landscape provides to those who spend time in it, and that are part of what draws researchers back to the Ozarks year after year. The landscape does not make the archaeology easier, but it makes the work of understanding it feel worthwhile in ways that extend beyond the purely intellectual, and that feeling of the worthwhile is part of what sustains the long-term commitment that serious archaeological research requires. The long-term commitment is what the Ozarks need, not the occasional survey or the quick report driven by a development deadline, but sustained engagement with the archaeological record over the kind of timescale that the record itself represents. The sites that have been most productively studied in the Ozarks are the ones that have been the subject of research programs extending over decades, where successive generations of researchers have built on the work of their predecessors, and where the accumulation of data has reached the point where patterns that were invisible in the early years of research have become legible. The sites that remain least understood are the ones that have been visited once or twice, noted in the site files, and then left unattended. The fundamental challenge of Ozark archaeology, and indeed of the archaeology of any complex region, is the mobilization of sufficient sustained attention to the record that exists in the landscape. Attention that is both broad enough to encompass the full geographic and temporal scope of the record, and deep enough to extract the kind of interpretive understanding that makes the investment worthwhile. That is a challenge that the current generation of researchers is more aware of and more creative in addressing than any previous generation. And the work they are doing in the Ozarks right now is laying the foundation for the understanding that future generations will build on. The Ozarks have been accumulating their history for 300 million years. The understanding of that history has been accumulating for a much shorter time, and there is much more of it to come. Every hollow that is walked carefully, every rock shelter that is documented fully, every spring that is surveyed systematically, every cave that is mapped completely, every oral tradition that is recorded and analyzed respectfully, every LiDAR dataset that is ground-truthed, every radiocarbon date that is obtained from a well-documented context adds to the picture. The picture is already interesting. It is going to become considerably more interesting as the work continues. That is the nature of good research in a rich region, and the Ozarks are a rich region in every sense that matters for archaeological understanding. The rivers are still clear, the caves are still deep, the springs are still running, and the ground still has most of its secrets. You do not have to be an archaeologist to find this worth knowing about, or worth caring about, or worth spending a few hours of a sleepless night in the company of. The deep history of the ground under our feet, the evidence that things happened here, in the middle of the continent, over spans of time that dwarf recorded history, that is a story that belongs to everyone who lives in this country, not just to the specialists who study it, or the descendants of the people who made it. It is part of what this place is, underneath the surface of what we have put on top of it in the past few centuries. And the deeper you dig into it, the more remarkable it becomes, and the more you realize that the standard story of what happened in the middle of North America before Europeans arrived is a very thin account of something very thick. The Ozarks know this. The limestone knows it. The springs know it. The caves know it. The rivers have been carrying it along in their current for as long as there have been rivers here to carry anything at all. That is the final thing worth sitting with, in the dark, before sleep. The Ozarks are not just old, they are continuous. They did not pause and wait for someone to notice them. They kept being what they are. Through ice ages and warm periods and droughts and floods and the arrival and departure and arrival again of human beings, through all of the things that happened and the things that were recorded and the things that were not, the continuity is real, and it is one of the most significant things about a place that has many significant things about it. Sleep well. The rivers will still be running in the morning. There is a specific cluster of questions about the Ozarks that archaeologists return to repeatedly, and that the evidence has not yet resolved to anyone's satisfaction. These are not fringe questions. They are the kinds of questions that appear in peer-reviewed publications and in the grant applications of respected researchers at well-funded institutions. They are questions that the available evidence raises and that the available evidence does not answer. Questions that require either more evidence or different methods or both. The most fundamental of these is the question of population. How many people were living in the Ozarks at any given period in the pre-contact past? This seems like a straightforward empirical question, but it is extraordinarily difficult to answer from the archaeological record. The number of known sites provides a lower bound on the population that was present, but it is a lower bound that is certainly far below the actual population because the formal site record is known to be substantially incomplete. The density and volume of artifact deposits at known sites provides additional information, but translating artifact density into population estimates requires assumptions about use intensity and discard rates that are difficult to validate. Skeletal populations from burial sites can be studied for demographic patterns, but the burial samples from Ozark sites are small and in some cases poorly documented. Environmental reconstruction can tell you something about the carrying capacity of the landscape at different periods, but carrying capacity is an upper bound on population that actual populations may have been far below. The best current estimates for Ozark population at different periods are based on combinations of all these sources of evidence, and they are all presented with wide uncertainty ranges that reflect the genuine difficulty of the estimation problem. What those estimates consistently show is that the Ozarks supported larger populations in the woodland and Mississippian periods than the light occupation of the region at the time of sustained European contact would suggest, and that the decline from those earlier population levels to the contact period levels involved a reduction that was substantial rather than marginal. The magnitude of that decline and its timing and causes are among the most important unsettled questions in Ozark archaeology. The second major cluster of unresolved questions concerns the organization of exchange. The Ozarks were connected to the Hopewell interaction sphere and to the Mississippian exchange network, as the material evidence clearly shows. But the organizational mechanisms that maintained those connections are poorly understood. Who controlled the exchange? Was it organized through political hierarchies with specific leaders directing the production and distribution of exchange goods? Was it organized through kinship networks with exchange relationships maintained through marriage and ceremonial partnership? Was it organized through market-like mechanisms with demand and supply driving exchange through competitive negotiations? Or was it some combination of these that varied by period, by type of good, and by the specific communities involved? These questions matter because the answers to them would tell you something about the nature of Ozark society at different periods, about the degree to which there was political centralization and social stratification, about the extent to which the Ozarks were integrated into the broader Mississippian political economy versus participating in it through more autonomous exchange relationships. The material evidence alone cannot distinguish between these possibilities, because different organizational mechanisms can produce similar patterns in the material record. What is needed, and what the integration of oral historical evidence and ethnographic comparison can begin to provide, is a more contextually informed interpretation of the exchange patterns that the material evidence documents. The third cluster of unresolved questions concerns the meaning of the ceremonial record. The cave art, the mound mortuary traditions, the elaborate ceremonial objects that appear in the most significant Ozark sites, all of these represent expressions of a system of beliefs and practices that organized a significant portion of the social life of pre-contact Ozark communities. But the content of those beliefs and the specific meanings of the ceremonial practices are accessible only in the most partial and indirect way from the material record alone. The iconography of the cave art can be described formally, and comparative analysis with art from other regions and other periods can suggest connections and possible meanings. The spatial organization of ceremonial sites can be described and analyzed for patterns that might reflect deliberate design principles. The distribution of specific ritual objects can be mapped, and the patterns of that distribution can be interpreted in light of what is known about exchange and political organization. But the gap between this kind of formal and comparative analysis and an actual understanding of what the Ozark ceremonial tradition meant to the people who maintained it is enormous, and bridging it requires sources of evidence that material archaeology alone cannot provide. The oral traditions of the Osage and the other indigenous peoples with historical connections to the Ozarks do not provide a direct key to the meaning of the pre-contact ceremonial record. The Osage ceremonial system, documented in the early 20th century, is the system of a specific historically situated community, not a direct preservation of whatever existed in the Ozarks before the social and political disruptions of the contact period. But it does provide a window into a way of relating to the landscape and to the cosmos that is continuous in broad terms with what the pre-contact material record suggests. And that window is valuable even if it does not provide direct interpretive access to the specific meanings of specific earlier artifacts or sites. The integration of Osage cosmological knowledge with the analysis of the pre-contact ceremonial record is one of the most productive areas of collaborative research in Ozark archaeology, and the results of that integration are consistently enriching both the interpretation of the material record and the understanding of the oral tradition in ways that neither source of knowledge could achieve independently. There is a place in the central Missouri Ozarks, in the current river watershed, where the river makes a long, slow bend around a limestone bluff that rises 200 feet above the water. At the base of the bluff, at the waterline, there is a series of horizontal ledges in the limestone where the rock has been undercut by the river's erosion, ledges that are wide enough to stand on and that extend for several hundred feet along the base of the bluff. Above the ledges, the face of the bluff shows the full sequence of Paleozoic limestone strata, each layer slightly different in color and texture from the one above and below it, a visible record of the slow accumulation of marine sediments over the millions of years when this part of the continent was covered by a shallow sea. On the ledges at the base of the bluff, where the river washes in spring floods, there are smooth cobbles of chert in various colors, worn by the river from the limestone above and deposited in the quiet water behind the bluff's base. Some of those cobbles are flint-knapping material of good quality, the kind of material that pre-contact toolmakers would have recognized and valued. And in the soft sediment above the current waterline, behind the largest of the ledges, there are the carbonized fragments of wood and the scattered stone flakes that indicate, to someone who knows what to look for, that this ledge was used as a working spot by someone in the past. The ledge is not on the formal site record. It has not been formally reported or documented in the state files, but it is there, one of thousands of similar places along the Ozark rivers, where the physical geometry of the landscape created a spot that was useful to people in the past, and that preserves the evidence of that use in a form that will survive until someone notices it and records it formally, or until a flood removes it and the evidence is gone. This is what doing archaeology in the Ozarks actually looks like from the ground level. It is not the dramatic moment of discovery that the popular imagination associates with the discipline. It is the patient accumulation of observations made over long stretches of time in specific places the building of a picture from thousands of small pieces of evidence that each by itself tells you very little, but that together begin to compose an image of what was happening in this landscape over the millennia before the settlement. Period. The image is never complete. There are always more pieces to find and more gaps to acknowledge. But the pieces that have been found so far are remarkable, and the image they are beginning to compose, of a landscape that was as complex and as deeply inhabited as any in North America, a landscape whose pre-contact history rivals in richness and sophistication the histories of the regions that receive much more popular and scholarly attention, is an image worth knowing about and worth sharing. The Ozarks deserve the attention. The history embedded in their limestone deserves to be read. And the reading of it, which is the work of generations of researchers past and present and future, is a gift to the broader understanding of what North America was before the European arrival, a gift that we are only beginning to unwrap. That unwrapping continues, patiently and carefully, in the hollows and the caves and the river valleys of the Ozark Plateau, in the archaeological field seasons that happen every summer in the most important and the least known corners of the region, in the laboratory analysis that turns artifact assemblages into historical narratives, and in the collaborative conversations between researchers and knowledge keepers that are the most productive frontier in Ozark scholarship today. The deeper we dig, the stranger and richer it gets. And the work of digging has barely begun. The textiles recovered from Ozark Bluff dweller sites deserve more attention than they typically receive in accounts of pre-contact North American material culture. Most discussions of pre-Columbian North American textiles focus on the Southwest, where the preservation conditions produced by the dry desert environment have maintained an extraordinary record of weaving traditions going back several thousand years. The Ozarks, whose cave environment provided preservation conditions almost as favorable as the desert, have yielded a body of textile material that is distinctive in both its extent and its sophistication, but that has been overshadowed in the popular and scholarly literature by the more extensively documented Southwest tradition. The plant fibers used in Ozark Bluff dweller textiles include dogbane, Indian hemp, cedar bark, milkweed, and various grasses, all of which occur naturally in the Ozark landscape, and all of which require specific processing to transform from raw plant material into usable fiber. The preparation of fiber for weaving from any of these plants is a multi-step process involving retting, where the plant stalks are soaked in water to loosen the fiber bundles, hackling, where the loosened fibers are combed to align them, and spinning, where the aligned fibers are twisted into usable cordage. Each of these steps requires specific knowledge and specific tools, and the quality of the finished textile depends on the skill with which each step is executed. The textiles from the best-preserved Ozark Bluff dweller sites show levels of technical execution that are comparable to the finest textile production documented from any pre-contact North American context. The thread counts in some of the woven fabrics are high enough that the individual threads must have been spun to a diameter of less than a millimeter, a level of spinning precision that requires both skill and the right equipment. Specifically, a well-balanced spindle whorl of appropriate weight and diameter. Spindle whorls are among the most common ceramic objects found in Ozark sites, testifying to the importance of spinning in the domestic economy of pre-contact communities and to the widespread practice of the craft at a community rather than a specialist level. The basketry from the Bluff dweller sites is equally impressive. Multiple weaving techniques are represented, including plaiting, twining, and coiling, and within each technique, there is evidence of variation in the specific methods used that reflects the development of a rich technical tradition over time. Some baskets show the use of more than one technique in the same piece, a level of technical integration that implies mastery of multiple weaving methods and the ability to combine them effectively. The diversity of the basket forms represented in the Ozark collections, including open weave gathering baskets, tightly woven storage containers, and specialized forms whose function is not always obvious, reflects the range of uses to which basketry was put in pre-contact Ozark communities and the sophistication of the craft tradition that supplied those uses. The organic materials recovered from the Ozark Bluff dweller sites, taken together, represent a window into aspects of pre-contact life that the stone and ceramic record alone cannot provide. They show the food plants that people were cultivating and collecting, the medicines they were preparing, the clothing they were wearing, the containers they were using to store and transport food and water, and the cordage and fabric that held together the physical fabric of their daily lives. This record is incomplete because only the materials that happen to be deposited in dry cave contexts have survived, and the cave deposits themselves have been disturbed by generations of collectors who did not maintain the contextual information that would allow the materials to be precisely dated and interpreted. But what survives is sufficient to demonstrate that the pre-contact peoples of the Ozarks were producing material culture of a quality and diversity that belies any characterization of them as simple or primitive. The degree to which the Ozark textile and basketry tradition connects to the broader traditions of the eastern United States, and the degree to which it represents a locally distinctive development, is a question that has been examined in some detail by researchers studying the craft traditions of the eastern woodlands. The evidence suggests both connection and distinctiveness. The basic techniques of twining and plaiting that characterize Ozark basketry are shared across much of eastern North America, reflecting a common heritage of fiber craftsmanship that predates the regional differentiation of the later pre-contact period. But the specific forms and the specific decorative traditions of Ozark baskets have locally distinctive features that suggest the development of a regional craft tradition with its own aesthetic character and its own technical innovations. This combination of shared tradition and local distinctiveness is characteristic of most aspects of pre-contact Ozark material culture, and it reflects the broader pattern of the Ozarks' position in the pre-contact world, connected enough to the surrounding regions to share the major cultural and technical developments of each period, but distinct enough in its ecological setting and its cultural trajectory to develop locally specific expressions of those shared traditions. That combination of connection and distinctiveness, of participation in the continental and regional cultural world while developing something recognizably specific to the Ozark place and the Ozark people, is what makes the archaeology of the region consistently interesting. It is a region that was never isolated, but was always in some sense its own thing, a place where the specific features of the landscape, the geology, the hydrology, the ecology, the long continuity of human presence, produced a cultural character that set it apart from its neighbors even as it maintained the connections that made it part of a larger world. The chert quarries of the Ozarks, some of which have been continuously worked from the Paleo-Indian period through the historic era, are among the most durable records of pre-contact human activity in the region. The quarry sites are defined by the accumulation of lithic debitage, the waste flakes and shatter produced by the napping of chert nodules into usable tools that builds up around productive outcrops over long periods of sustained use. At the major Ozark quarry sites, the accumulated debitage deposits are meters deep and cover several acres of ground, representing the waste product of many thousands of tool-making episodes across many millennia. These quarries were known places, deliberately embedded in the exchange networks that moved the material they produced to communities across the broader continental landscape. The full work of reading what those quarries and those caves and those springs and those rivers have preserved across all that long time remains far from finished, and the research consistently points toward a history that is richer, more complex, and considerably more worth knowing than the standard accounts have yet managed to convey.